4. The philosophical idealists as comrades in arms and successors of Empirio-Criticism. So far we have examined Empirio-Criticism taken by itself. We must now examine it in its historical development and in its connection and relation with other philosophical trends. First comes the question of the relation of Mach and of Nereus to Kant. The criticism of Kantianism from the left and from the right. Both Mach and of Nereus began their philosophical careers in the 70s, when the fashionable cry in German professorial circles was back to Kant. And, indeed, both founders of Empirio-Criticism in their philosophical development started from Kant. As Mach says, Kant's, critical idealism was, as I acknowledge with the deepest gratitude, the starting point of all my critical thought. But I found it impossible to remain faithful to it. Very soon I began to return to the views of Berkeley. And then, arrived at views akin to those of Hume. And even today I cannot help regarding Berkeley and Hume as far more consistent thinkers than Kant. Analysis of Sensations, p. 292. Thus Mach quite definitely admits that having begun with Kant he soon followed the line of Berkeley and Hume. Let us turn to of Nereus. In the preface to his Critique of Pure Experience, 1876, of Nereus already in the foreword states that the words Kritik der reinen Erfahrung, Critique of Pure Experience, are indicative of his attitude towards Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and of course, of an antagonistic attitude towards Kant. 1876 ed. p. 4. In what does of Nereus' antagonism to Kant consist? In the fact that Kant, in of Nereus' opinion, had not sufficiently purified experience. It is with this purification of experience that of Nereus deals in his Prolegomena, sections 56, 72 and many other places. Of what does of Nereus purify the Kantian doctrine of experience? In the first place, of a priorism. In section 56 he says, the question as to whether the superfluous a priori conceptions of reason should and could be eliminated from the content of experience and thereby pure experience par excellence established is, as far as I know, raised here, as such, for the first time. We have already seen that of Nereus in this way purified Kantianism of the recognition of necessity and causality. Secondly, he purifies Kantianism of the assumption of substance, section 95, i.e., the thing in itself, which, in of Nereus' opinion is not given in the stuff of actual experience but is imported into it by thought. We shall presently see that of Nereus' definition of his philosophical line entirely coincides with that of Mach, differing only in pompousness of formulation. But we must first note that of Nereus is telling a plain untruth when he asserts that it was he who in 1876 for the first time raised the question of purifying experience, i.e., of purifying the Kantian doctrine of a priorism and the assumption of the thing in itself. As a matter of fact, the development of German classical philosophy immediately after Kant gave rise to a criticism of Kantianism exactly along the very line followed by of Nereus. This line is represented in German classical philosophy by Schultz Sensitimus, an adherent of Humean agnosticism, and by J.G. Fichte, an adherent of Berkeleyanism, i.e., of subjective idealism. In 1792 Schultz Sensitimus criticized Kant for this very recognition of a priorism, op. Cit. pages 56,141, etc., and of the thing in itself. We skeptics, or followers of Hume, says Schultz, reject the thing in itself as being beyond the bounds of all experience. p. 57, we reject objective knowledge. p. 25, we deny that space and time really exist outside us. p. 100, we reject the presence in our experience of necessity. p. 112, causality, force, etc. p. 113. One cannot attribute to them any reality outside our conceptions. p. 114, Kant proves a priority dogmatically, saying that since we cannot think otherwise there is therefore an a priori law of thought. This argument, Schultz replies to Kant, has long been utilized in philosophy to prove the objective nature of what lies outside our ideas. p. 141, arguing thus, we may attribute causality to things in themselves. p. 142, experience never tells us, verificamus, that the action on us of objective things produces ideas, and Kant by no means proved that this something, which lies outside our reason, must be regarded as a thing in itself, distinct from our sensation, Gemut. But sensation also may be thought of as the sole basis of all our knowledge. p. 265, the Kantian critique of pure reason bases its argument on the proposition that every act of cognition begins with the action of objective things on our organs of sensation, Gemut, but it then disputes the truth and reality of this proposition. p. 266, Kant in no way refuted the idealist Berkeley, pages 268–72. It is evident from this that the Humean Schultz rejects Kant's doctrine of the thing in itself as an inconsistent concession to materialism, i.e., to the dogmatic assertion that in our sensations we are given objective reality, or, in other words, that our ideas are caused by the action of objective things, independent of our mind, on our sense organs. The agnostic Schultz reproaches the agnostic Kant on the grounds that the latter's assumption of the thing in itself contradicts agnosticism and leads to materialism. In the same way, but even more vigorously, Kant is criticized by the subjective idealist Fichte, who maintains that Kant's assumption of the thing in itself independent of the self is realism, Werke, I. p. 483, and that Kant makes no clear distinction between realism and idealism. Fichte sees a crying inconsistency in the assumption of Kant and the Kantians that the thing in itself is the basis of objective reality, p. 480, for this is in contradiction to critical idealism. "With you," exclaims Fichte, addressing the realist expositors of Kant, "the earth rests on the great elephant, and the great elephant rests on the earth. Your thing in itself, which is only thought, acts on the self." p. 483. Thus Avnarius was profoundly mistaken in imagining that he for the first time undertook a purification of the experience of Kant from a priorism and from the thing in itself, and that he was thereby giving rise to a new trend in philosophy. In reality he was continuing the old line of Hume and Berkeley, Schultz and Sidemus and J.G. Fichte. Avnarius imagined that he was purifying experience in general. In reality he was only purifying agnosticism of Kantianism. He fought not against the agnosticism of Kant. Agnosticism is a denial of objective reality given in sensation, but for a purer agnosticism, for the elimination of Kant's assumption, which is contradictory to agnosticism, that there is a thing in itself, albeit unknowable, nominal and other-sided, that there is necessity and causality, albeit a priori, given in our understanding, and not in objective reality. He fought Kant not from the left, as the materialists fought Kant, but from the right, as the skeptics and idealists fought Kant. He imagined that he was advancing, when in reality he was retreating to the program of criticizing Kant, which Kuno Fischer, speaking of Schultz and Sidemus, aptly characterized in the following words: "The critique of pure reason with pure reason, i.e., a priorism, left out his skepticism. The critique of pure reason with the thing in itself left out his Berkeleyan idealism." History of Modern Philosophy, German ed., 1869, Volume 5, p. 115. This brings us to one of the most curious episodes in our whole Makad, in the whole campaign of the Russian Makans against Engels and Marx. The latest discovery by Bogdanov and Bazarov, Yushkevich and Valentinov, trumpeted by them in 1,000 different keys, is that Plekhanov is making a luckless attempt to reconcile Engels with Kant by the aid of a compromise, a thing in itself which is just a wee bit knowable. Studies, p. 67 and many other places. This discovery of Armikins discloses a veritable bottomless pit of utter confusion and monstrous misunderstanding both of Kant and of the whole course of development of German classical philosophy. The principal feature of Kant's philosophy is the reconciliation of materialism with idealism, a compromise between the two, the combination within one system of heterogeneous and contrary philosophical trends. When Kant assumes that something outside us, a thing in itself, corresponds to our ideas, he is a materialist. When he declares this thing in itself to be unknowable, transcendental, other-sided, he is an idealist. Recognizing experience, sensations, as the only source of our knowledge, Kant is directing his philosophy towards sensationalism, and via sensationalism, under certain conditions, towards materialism. Recognizing the a priority of space, time, causality, etc., Kant is directing his philosophy towards idealism. Both consistent materialists and consistent idealists, as well as the pure agnostics, the Humeans, have mercilessly criticized Kant for this inconsistency. The materialists blamed Kant for his idealism, rejected the idealist features of his system, demonstrated the knowability, the this-sidedness of the thing in itself, the absence of a fundamental difference between the thing in itself and the phenomenon, the need of deducing causality, etc., not from a priori laws of thought, but from objective reality. The agnostics and idealists blamed Kant for his assumption of the thing in itself as a concession to materialism, realism or naive realism. The agnostics, moreover, rejected not only the thing in itself, but a priorism as well, while the idealists demanded the consistent deduction from pure thought not only of the a priori forms of perception, but of the world as a whole, by magnifying human thought to an abstract self, or to an absolute idea, or to a universal will, etc., etc. And here are Machists, without noticing that they have taken as their teachers people who had criticized Kant from the standpoint of skepticism and idealism, began to rend their clothes and to cover their heads with ashes at the sight of monstrous people who criticized Kant from a diametrically opposite point of view, who rejected the slightest element of agnosticism, skepticism, and idealism in his system, who demonstrated that the thing in itself is objectively real, fully knowable and this-sided, that it does not differ fundamentally from appearance, that it becomes transformed into appearance at every step in the development of the individual consciousness of man and the collective consciousness of mankind. Help, they cried, this is an illegitimate mixture of materialism and Kantianism. When I read the assurances of our Machists that they criticize Kant far more consistently and thoroughly than any of the antiquated materialists, it always seems to me as though Purishkevich, 1, had joined our company and was shouting, I criticized the constitutional Democrats far more consistently and thoroughly than you Marxist gentlemen. There is no question about it, Mr. Purishkevich. Politically consistent people can and always will criticize the constitutional Democrats from diametrically opposite points of view, but after all it must not be forgotten that you criticized the constitutional Democrats for being excessively democratic, while we criticize them for being insufficiently democratic. The Macans criticize Kant for being too much of a materialist, while we criticize him for not being enough of a materialist. The Macans criticize Kant from the right, we from the left. The Humean Schultz and the subjective idealist Fichte may be taken as examples of the former category of critics in the history of classical German philosophy. As we have already seen, they try to obliterate the realistic elements of Kantianism. Just as Schultz and Fichte criticized Kant himself, so the Humean Empirio-Criticists and the subjective idealist immanentists criticized the German neo-Kantians of the second half of the 19th century. The line of Hume and Berkeley reappeared in a slightly renovated verbal garb. Mach and Avnerius reproached Kant not because his treatment of the thing in itself was not sufficiently realistic, not sufficiently materialistic, but because he assumed its existence, not because he refused to deduce causality and necessity in nature from objective reality, but because he assumed causality and necessity at all, except perhaps purely logical necessity. The immanentists were at one with the Empirio-Criticists, also criticizing Kant from the Humean and Berkeleyan standpoint. For instance, Lechler in 1879, in the work in which he praised Mach as a remarkable philosopher, reproached Kant for his inconsistency and connivance at realism as expressed in the concept of the thing in itself, that nominal residuum of vulgar realism. Der Realism ist der modernen Naturwissenschaft, Us. p. 9, Leckler calls materialism vulgar realism, in order to make it stronger. Leckler writes, in our opinion all those parts of the Kantian theory which gravitate towards realismus vulgaris should be vanquished and eliminated as being inconsistencies and bastard, zwitterhaft, products from the idealist point of view. p. 41. The inconsistencies and contradictions in the Kantian theory of knowledge arise from the amalgamation, Verquickung, of idealist criticism with still unvanquished remnants of realistic dogmatism. p. 170. By realistic dogmatism Leckler means materialism. Another immanentist, Johannes Reinke, reproached Kant because he realistically walled himself off from Berkeley with the thing in itself. J. Reinke, Die Welt als Wahrnehmungsbegriff, Berlin, 1880, p. 9. The philosophical activity of Kant bore an essentially polemical character. With the thing in itself he turned against German rationalism, i.e., the old fideism of the 18th century, and with pure contemplation against English empiricism. p. 25. I would compare the Kantian thing in itself with a movable lid placed over a pit. The thing looks so innocent and safe, one steps on it and suddenly falls into the world in itself. p. 27. That is why Kant is not liked by the associates of Mach and of Nereus, the immanentists. They do not like him because in some respects he approaches the pit of materialism. And here are some examples of the criticism of Kant from the left. Feuerbach reproaches Kant not for his realism, but for his idealism, and describes his system as idealism based on empiricism. Werke, 2, p. 296. Here is a particularly important remark on Kant by Feuerbach. Kant says, if we regard, as we should, the objects of our perceptions as mere appearances, we thereby admit that at the bottom of appearances is a thing in itself, although we do not know how it is actually constructed, but only know its appearance, i.e., the manner in which our senses are affected, affected, by this unknown something. Hence, our reason, by the very fact that it accepts appearances, also admits the existence of things in themselves, and to that extent we can say that to entertain an idea of such entities which lie at the bottom of appearances, and consequently are but thought entities, is not only permissible, but unavoidable. Having selected a passage from Kant where the thing in itself is regarded merely as a mental thing, a thought entity, and not a real thing, Feuerbach directs his whole criticism against it. Therefore the objects of the senses, the objects of experience, are for the mind only appearances, and not truth. Yet the thought entities are not actual objects for the mind. The Kantian philosophy is a contradiction between subject and object, between entity and existence, thinking and being. Entity is left to the mind, existence to the senses. Existence without entity, i.e., the existence of appearances without objective reality, is mere appearance, the sensible things, while entity without existence is mere thought, the thought entities, the noumena. They are thought of, but they lack existence, at least for us, and objectivity. They are the things in themselves, the true things, but they are not real things. But what a contradiction, to sever truth from reality, reality from truth. Werke, 2, pages 302-03, Feuerbach reproaches Kant not because he assumes things in themselves, but because he does not grant them reality, i.e., objective reality, because he regards them as mere thought entities, and not as entities possessing existence, i.e., real and actually existing. Feuerbach rebukes Kant for deviating from materialism. The Kantian philosophy is a contradiction, Feuerbach wrote to Bolin on 26 March 1858, it inevitably leads either to Fittian idealism or to sensationalism. The former conclusion belongs to the past, the latter to the present and the future. K. Grun, Op. Cit. 2, p. 49. We have already seen that Feuerbach advocates objective sensationalism, i.e., materialism. The new turn from Kant to agnosticism and idealism, to Hume and Berkeley, is undoubtedly reactionary, even from Feuerbach's standpoint. And his ardent follower, Albrecht Rau, who together with the merits of Feuerbach also adopted his faults, which were eliminated by Marx and Engels, criticized Kant wholly in the spirit of his teacher. The Kantian philosophy is an amphibole, ambiguity. It is both materialism and idealism, and the key to its essence lies in its dual nature. As a materialist or an empiricist, Kant cannot help conceding things an existence, wasn't it, outside us. But as an idealist he could not rid himself of the prejudice that the soul is an entity totally different from sensible things. Hence there are real things and a human mind which apprehends those things. But how can the mind approach things totally different from itself? The way out, adopted by Kant, is as follows: the mind possesses certain a priori knowledge, in virtue of which things must appear to it as they do. Hence, the fact that we understand things as we do is a fact of our creation. For the mind which lives within us is nothing but the divine mind, and just as God created the world out of nothing, so the human mind creates out of things something which they are not in themselves. Thus Kant guarantees real things their existence as things in themselves. Kant, however, needed the soul, because immortality was for him a moral postulate. The thing in itself, gentlemen, says Rau, addressing the neo-Kantians in general and the muddle-headed Lenin in particular, who falsified the history of materialism, is what separates the idealism of Kant from the idealism of Berkeley. It spans the gap between materialism and idealism. Such is my criticism of the Kantian philosophy, and let those who can refute it. For the materialist a distinction between a priori knowledge and the thing in itself is absolutely superfluous, for since he nowhere breaks the continuity of nature, since he does not regard matter and mind as two fundamentally different things, but as two aspects of one and the same thing, he need not resort to artifice in order to bring the mind and the thing into conjunction. 2. Further, Engels, as we have seen, rebuked Kant for being an agnostic, but not for his deviation from consistent agnosticism. Lafargue, Engels' disciple, argued in 1900 against the Kantians, amongst whom at the time was Charles Rappaport, as follows: at the beginning of the 19th century our bourgeoisie, having completed its task of revolutionary destruction, began to repudiate its Voltairean and free-thinking philosophy. Catholicism, which the master decorator Chateaubriand painted in romantic colors, was restored to fashion, and Sébastien Mercier imported the idealism of Kant in order to give the coup de grâce to the materialism of the encyclopedists, whose protagonists had been guillotined by Robespierre. At the end of the 19th century, which will go down in history as the bourgeois century, the intellectuals attempted to crush the materialism of Marx and Engels beneath the philosophy of Kant. The reactionary movement started in Germany, without offense to the socialist integralists who would like to ascribe the honor to their chief, Malin. But Malin himself had been to the school of Hochberg, Bernstein and the other disciples of Dühring, who were reforming Marxism in Zurich. Lafargue is referring to the ideological movement in German socialism in the later 70s. 3. It is to be expected that Jaurès, Fournier and our other intellectuals will also treat us to Kant as soon as they have mastered his terminology. Rappaport is mistaken when he assures us that for Marx the ideal and the real are identical. In the first place, we never employ such metaphysical phraseology. An idea is as real as the object of which it is the reflection in the brain. To provide a little recreation for the comrades who have to acquaint themselves with bourgeois philosophy, I shall explain the substance of this famous problem which has so much exercised spiritualist minds. The working man who eats sausage and receives 100 sous a day knows very well that he is robbed by the employer and is nourished by pork meat, that the employer is a robber and that the sausage is pleasant to the taste and nourishing to the body. Not at all, say the bourgeois sophists, whether they are called Pyrrho, Hume or Kant. His opinion is personal, an entirely subjective opinion, He might with equal reason maintain that the employer is his benefactor and that the sausage consists of chopped leather, for he cannot know things in themselves. The question is not properly put, that is the whole trouble. In order to know an object, man must first verify whether his senses deceive him or not. The chemists have gone still further. They have penetrated into bodies, they have analyzed them, decomposed them into their elements, and then performed the reverse procedure, they have recomposed them from their elements. And from the moment that man is able to produce things for his own use from these elements, he may, as Engels says, assert that he knows the things in themselves. The God of the Christians, if he existed and if he created the world, could do no more. 4. We have taken the liberty of making this long quotation in order to show how Lafargue understood Engels and how he criticized Kant from the left, not for those aspects of Kantianism which distinguish it from Humism, but for those which are common to both Kant and Hume, not for his assumption of the thing in itself, but for his inadequately materialist view of it. And lastly, Karl Kautsky in his Ethics also criticizes Kant from a standpoint diametrically opposed to that of Hume and Berkeley. Arguing against Kant's epistemology, he writes, that I see green, red and white is grounded in my faculty of sight. But that green is something different from red testifies to something that lies outside of me, to real differences between the things. The relations and differences between the things themselves revealed to me by the individual space and time concepts are real relations and differences of the external world, not conditioned by the nature of my perceptive faculty. If this were really so, if Kant's doctrine of the ideality of time and space were true, we could know nothing about the world outside us, not even that it exists. Russian translation, pages 33-34. Thus the entire school of Feuerbach, Marx and Engels turned from Kant to the left, to a complete rejection of all idealism and of all agnosticism. But Armachans followed the reactionary trend in philosophy, Mach and of Nerius, who criticized Kant from the standpoint of Hume and Berkeley. Of course, it is the sacred right of every citizen, and particularly of every intellectual, to follow any ideological reactionary he likes. But when people who have radically severed relations with the very foundations of Marxism in philosophy begin to dodge, confuse matters, hedge and assure us that they too are Marxists in philosophy, that they are almost in agreement with Marx, and have only slightly supplemented him, the spectacle is a far from pleasant one. How the Empirio-symbolist Yushkevich ridiculed the Empirio-criticist Chernow is, of course, amusing, writes Mr. P. Yushkevich, to see how Mr. Chernow tries to make the agnostic positivist Kantian and Spencerian, Mikhailovsky, a forerunner of Mach and of Nerius. Op. Cit. p. 73. First of all, what is amusing here is Mr. Yushkevich's astonishing ignorance. Like all Voroshilovs, he conceals this ignorance under a display of erudite words and names. The passage quoted is from a paragraph devoted to the relation between Machism and Marxism. And although he undertakes to treat of this subject, Mr. Yushkevich does not know that for Engels, as for every materialist, the adherents of the Humean line and the adherents of the Kantian line are equally agnostics. Therefore, to contrast agnosticism generally with Machism, when even Mach himself confesses to being a follower of Hume, is simply to prove oneself an ignoramus in philosophy. The phrase agnostic positivism is also absurd, for the adherents of Hume in fact call themselves positivists. Mr. Yushkevich, who has taken Petzold as his teacher, should have known that Petzold definitely regards Empirio-criticism as positivism. And finally, to drag in the names of Auguste Comte and Herbert Spencer is again absurd, for Marxism rejects not what distinguishes one positivist from another, but what is common to both and what makes a philosopher a positivist instead of a materialist. Our Voroshilov needed this display of words so as to mesmerize his reader, to stun him with the cacophony of words, to distract his attention away from the essence of the matter to empty trifles. And the essence of the matter is the radical difference between materialism and the broad current of positivism, which includes Auguste Comte, Herbert Spencer, Mikhailovsky, a number of neo-Kantians, and Mach and Avnerius. The essence of the matter has been very accurately expressed by Engels in his Ludwig Feuerbach, where he places all the Kantians and Humenes of that period, i.e., the 80s of the last century, in the camp of wretched eclectics, pettifoggers, Flachnecker, literally, fleecrackers, and so on. 5. To whom this characterization can and must apply is a question on which our Voroshilovs did not wish to reflect. And since they are incapable of reflecting, we shall cite one illuminating comparison. Engels, speaking both in 1888 and 1892 of the Kantians and Humenes in general, mentions no names. 6. The only reference Engels makes to a book is his reference to the work of Stark on Feuerbach, which Engels analyzed. Stark takes great pains to defend Feuerbach against the attacks and doctrines of the vociferous lecturers who today go by the name of philosophers in Germany. For people who are interested in this afterbirth of German classical philosophy, this is a matter of importance. For Stark himself it may have appeared necessary. We, however, will spare the reader this. Ludwig Feuerbach, p. 25, 7. Engels wanted to spare the reader, that is, to save the Social Democrats from a pleasant acquaintance with the degenerate chatterboxes who call themselves philosophers, and who are implied by this afterbirth. We open Stark's book, C. N. Stark, Ludwig Feuerbach, Stuttgart, 1885, and find constant references to the adherents of Hume and Kant. Stark dissociates Feuerbach from these two trends. Stark quotes in this connection a real, Wintelband and a Lang. Pages 3, 18-19, 127, etc., in Stark. We open Avnerius The Human Concept of the World, which appeared in 1891, and on page 120 of the first German edition we read, the final result of our analysis concurs, although not absolutely, durchgehend, in the measure of the various points of view, with that reached by other investigators, for example, E. Laws, E. Mach, A. Real, W. Wundt. See also Schopenhauer. Whom was our Voroshilov Yushkevich jeering at? Avnerius has not the slightest doubt as to his kinship in principle, not regarding any particular question, but regarding the final result of Empirio-Criticism, to the Kantians Real and Laws and to the idealist Wundt. He mentions Mach between the two Kantians. And, indeed, are they not all one company, since Real and Laws purified Kant a la Hume, and Mach and Avnerius purified Hume a la Berkeley? Is it surprising that Engels wished to spare the German workers, to save them from a close acquaintance with this whole company of flea-cracking university lecturers? Engels could spare the German workers, but the Voroshilovs do not spare the Russian reader. It should be noted that an essentially eclectic combination of Kant and Hume, or Hume and Berkeley, is possible, so to speak, in varying proportions, by laying principal stress now on one, now on another element of the mixture. We saw above, for instance, that only one Micken, H. Klein-Peter, openly admits that he and Mach are solipsists, i.e., consistent Berkeleans. On the other hand, the Humean trend in the views of Mach and Avnerius is emphasized by many of their disciples and followers, Petzold, Willy, Pearson, the Russian Empirio-criticist Lesevich, the Frenchman Henri Delacroix, 8, and others. We shall cite one example, an especially eminent scientist who in philosophy also combined Hume with Berkeley, but who emphasized the materialist elements of this mixture. He is Thomas Huxley, the famous English scientist, who gave currency to the term agnostic and whom Engels undoubtedly had chiefly and primarily in mind when he spoke of English agnosticism. Engels in 1892 called this type of agnostics shamefaced materialists. 9. James Ward, the English spiritualist, in his book Naturalism and Agnosticism, wherein he chiefly attacks the scientific champion of agnosticism, Huxley, Volume 2, p. 229, bears out Engels' opinion when he says, in Huxley's case indeed the leaning towards the primacy of the physical side, series of elements Mach calls it, is often so pronounced that it can hardly be called parallelism at all. In spite of his vehement repudiation of the title of materialist as an affront to his untarnished agnosticism, I know of few recent writers who on occasion better deserve the title. Volume 2, pages 30–31. And James Ward quotes the following statements by Huxley in confirmation of his opinion: anyone who is acquainted with the history of science will admit that its progress has in all ages meant, and now more than ever means, the extension of the province of what we call matter and causation, and the concomitant gradual banishment from all regions of human thought of what we call spirit and spontaneity. Or, it is in itself of little moment whether we express the phenomena of matter in terms of spirit, or the phenomena of spirit in terms of matter. Each statement has a certain relative truth, relatively stable complexes of elements, according to Mach. But with a view to the progress of science, the materialistic terminology is in every way to be preferred. For it connects thought with the other phenomena of the universe. Whereas the alternative, or spiritualistic, terminology is utterly barren, and leads to nothing but obscurity and confusion of ideas. Thus there can be little doubt, that the further science advances, the more extensively and consistently will all the phenomena of nature be represented by materialistic formulae and symbols. Volume 1, p. 17–19, so argued the shamefaced materialist Huxley, who refused to accept materialism, regarding it as metaphysics that illegitimately goes beyond groups of sensations. And this same Huxley wrote, "If I were obliged to choose between absolute materialism and absolute idealism, I should feel compelled to accept the latter alternative. Our one certainty is the existence of the mental world." J. Ward, Volume 2, p. 216, Huxley's philosophy is as much a mixture of Hume and Berkeley as is Mach's philosophy. But in Huxley's case the Berkeleyan streaks are incidental, and agnosticism serves as a fig leaf for materialism. With Mach the coloring of the mixture is a different one, and Ward, the spiritualist, while bitterly combating Huxley, pats of Nereus and Mach affectionately on the back. The immanentists as comrades in arms of Mach and of Nereus. In speaking of Empirio-Criticism we could not avoid repeatedly mentioning the philosophers of the so-called immanentist school, the principal representatives of which are Supp, Lechler, Reinke, and Schubert-Soldern. It is now necessary to examine the relation of Empirio-Criticism to the immanentists and the nature of the philosophy preached by the latter. In 1902 Mach wrote, "Today I see that a host of philosophers, positivists, empirio-criticists, adherents of the immanentist philosophy, as well as a very few scientists, have all, without knowing anything of each other, entered on new paths which, in spite of their individual differences, converge almost towards one point." Analysis of Sensations, p. 9. Here we must first note Mach's unusually frank admission that very few scientists are followers of the supposedly new, but in truth very old, Humean Berkeleyan philosophy. Secondly, extremely important is Mach's opinion that this new philosophy is a broad current in which the immanentists are on the same footing as the empirio-criticists and the positivists. Mach repeats in the introduction to the Russian translation of the Analysis of Sensations, 1906, thus, "There is a common movement." p. 4, My position, Mach says in another place, moreover, borders closely on that of the representatives of the immanentist philosophy. I found hardly anything in this book, i.e., W. Supp, Outline of the Theory of Knowledge and Logic, with which, with perhaps a very slight change, I would not gladly agree. p. 46. Mach considers that Schubert-Soldern is also following close paths, p. 4, and as to Wilhelm Supp, Mach even dedicates to him his latest work, the summary so to speak of his philosophical labors, Knowledge and Error. Of Nereus, the other founder of Empirio-Criticism, wrote in 1894 that he was gladdened and encouraged by Supp's sympathy for Empirio-Criticism, and that the differences between him and Supp exist, perhaps, only temporarily, vielleicht nur Einstein noch bestehend. 10. And, finally, J. Petzold, whose teachings Lesevich regards as the last word in Empirio-Criticism, openly acclaims the trio, Sup, Mach and of Nereus, as the leaders of the new trend. Einführung in die Philosophie der reinen Erfahrung, B.D. 2, 1904, p. 295, Das Weltproblem, 1906, p. v. 146. On this point Petzold is definitely opposed to Willi, Einf. 2, 321, probably the only outstanding Macan who felt ashamed of such a kinship as Sup's and who tried to dissociate himself from him fundamentally, for which this disciple was reprimanded by his beloved teacher of Nereus. Of Nereus wrote the words about Sup above quoted in a comment on Willi's article against Sup, adding that Willi's criticism perhaps was put more strongly than was really necessary. Verdulgerschrift für wissenschaftliche Philosophie, 18. Jarg, 1894, p. 29, which also contains Willi's article against Sup. Having acquainted ourselves with the Empirio-Criticists' opinion of the Immanentists, let us examine the Immanentists' opinion of the Empirio-Criticists. We have already mentioned the opinion uttered by Leckler in 1879. Ch4 in 1882 explicitly expressed his agreement in part with the elder Fichte, i.e., the distinguished representative of subjective idealism, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, whose son was as inept in philosophy as was the son of Joseph Dietzken, and with Sup, Leckler, of Nereus and partly with Riemke, while Mach, die Geschichte die Wurzel des Satzes von der Haltung der Arbeit, is cited with particular gusto in opposition to natural historical metaphysics. 11. The term given to natural historical materialism by all the reactionary university lecturers and professors in Germany. In 1893, after the appearance of Nereus the human concept of the world, W. Sup hailed this work in an open letter to Professor of Nereus as a confirmation of the naive realism which he, Sup, himself advocated. My conception of thought, Sup wrote, excellently harmonizes with your, of Nereus, pure experience. 12. Then, in 1896, Ch4, summarizing the methodological trend in philosophy on which he bases himself, traces his genealogy from Berkeley and Hume down through F. A. Lang. The real beginning of our movement in Germany dates from Lang, and then through Laws, Sup, and Co., of Nereus and Mach, real, among the Neo-Kantians, ch. Renouvier, among the Frenchmen, etc. 13. Finally, in their programmatic introduction printed in the first issue of the philosophical organ of the Immanentists, alongside a declaration of war on materialism and an expression of sympathy with Charles Renouvier, we read, even in the camp of the scientists themselves voices of individual thinkers are being raised sermonizing against the growing arrogance of their colleagues, against the unphilosophical spirit which has taken possession of the natural sciences. Thus the physicist Mach. On all hands fresh forces are stirring and are working to destroy the blind faith in the infallibility of the natural sciences, and once again people are beginning to seek for other paths into the profundities of the mysterious, a better entrance to the house of truth. 14. A word or two about Ch. Renouvier. He is the head of the influential and widespread school in France known as the Neo-Criticists. His theoretical philosophy is a combination of the phenomenalism of Hume and the a priorism of Kant. The thing in itself is absolutely rejected. The connection of phenomena, order and law is declared to be a priori. Law is written with a capital letter and is converted into the basis of religion. The Catholic priests go into raptures over this philosophy. The Machiavelli scornfully refers to Renouvier as a second Apostle Paul, as an obscurantist of the first water and as a casuistic preacher of free will. Gegen die Soulwicht, p. 129. And it is such co-thinkers of the Immanentists who warmly greet Mach's philosophy. When his Mechanics appeared in a French translation, the organ of the Neo-Criticists, L'Année philosophique, edited by Pillin, a collaborator and disciple of Renouvier, wrote, "It is unnecessary to speak of the extent to which, in this criticism of substance, the thing in itself, Max Positive Science agrees with Neocritical Idealism. Volume 15, 1904, p. 179. As for the Russian Machins, they are all ashamed of their kinship with the eminentists, and one of course could not expect anything else of people who did not deliberately adopt their path of Struve, Menshikov, and the like. Bazarov alone refers to certain representatives of the immanentist school as realists. 15. Bogdanov briefly, and in fact falsely, declares that the immanentist school is only an intermediate forum between Kantianism and Empirio-Criticism. Empirio-Monism, B.K. 3, p. 22, Vitranov writes, generally speaking, the immanentists approach positivism in only one aspect of their theory, in other aspects they go far beyond it. Philosophical and Sociological Studies, p. 37, Valentinov says that the immanentist school clothed these Machin ideas in an unsuitable form and found themselves in the blind alley of solipsism. Op. Cit. p. 149, as you see, you pay your money and take your choice, Constitution and salmon mayonnaise, realism and solipsism. Our Machins are afraid to tell the plain and clear truth about the immanentists. The fact is that the immanentists are rank reactionaries, open advocates of fideism, unadulterated in their obscurantism. There is not one of them who has not frankly made his more theoretical works on epistemology a defense of religion and a justification of medievalism of one kind or another. Leckler, in 1879, advocated his philosophy as one that satisfies all the needs of a religiously inclined mind. Der Realismus, p. 73, J. Riehnke, in 1880, dedicated his theory of knowledge to the Protestant pastor Biederman and closed his book by preaching not a supersensible God, but God as a real concept. It was for this reason presumably, that Bazarov ranked certain immanentists among the realists. And moreover the objectivization of this real concept is relegated to practical life, while Biederman's Christian dogmatism is declared to be a model of scientific theology. J. Riehnke, Die Welt als Wahrnehmungsbegriff, Berlin, 1880, p. 312, Sup in the Zrift for immanente Philosophie assures us that though the immanentists deny the transcendental, God and the future life do not come under this concept. Zrift for immanente Philosophie, 2. Band, p. 52, in his Ethic he insists on the connection of the moral law with the metaphysical world conception and condemns the separation of the Church from the state as a senseless phrase. Dr. Wilhelm Supp, Grundzüge der Ethik und Philosophie, Principles of Ethics and the Philosophy of Law, Breslau, 1881, pages 181, 325. Schubert Soden in his Foundations of the Theory of Cognition deduces both the pre-existence of the self before the body and the after-existence of the self after the body, i.e., the immortality of the soul, op. Cit. p. 82, etc. In the social question, arguing against Babel, he defends, together with social reforms, suffrage based on class distinction, and says that the Social Democrats ignore the fact that without the divine gift of unhappiness there could be no happiness, p. 330, and thereupon laments the fact that materialism prevails, p. 242, he who in our time believes in a life beyond, or even in its possibility, is considered a fool. Ibid, and German Menshikovs like these, no less obscurantists of the first water than Renouvier, live in lasting concubinage with the Empirio-Criticists. Their theoretical kinship is incontestable. There is no more Kantianism in the immanentists than in Petzold-Torpearson. We saw above that they themselves regard themselves as disciples of Hume and Berkeley, an opinion of the immanentists that is generally recognized in philosophical literature. In order to show clearly what epistemological premises these comrades in arms of Mach and Vnerius proceed from, we shall quote some fundamental theoretical propositions from the works of immanentists. Leckler in 1879 had not yet invented the term immanent, which really signifies experiential, given in experience, and which is just as spurious a label for concealing corruption as the labels of the European bourgeois parties. In his first work, Leclerc frankly and explicitly calls himself a critical idealist, Der Realismus, pages 11, 21, 206, etc. In this work he criticizes Kant, as we have already seen, for his concessions to materialism, and clearly indicates his own path away from Kant to Fichte and Berkeley. Leclerc fights materialism in general and the tendency towards materialism displayed by the majority of scientists in particular as mercilessly as Supp, Schubert, Soden and Rink. Leclerc says, if we return to the standpoint of critical idealism, if we do not attribute a transcendental existence, i.e., an existence outside of human consciousness, to nature or the processes of nature, then for the subject the aggregate of bodies and his own body, insofar as he can see and feel it, together with all its changes, will be a directly given phenomenon of spatially connected coexistences and successions in time, and the whole explanation of nature will reduce itself to stating the laws of these coexistences and successions. p. 21, back to Kant. Said the reactionary neo-Kantians. Back to Fichte and Berkeley. Is essentially what the reactionary immanentists are saying. For Leclerc, all that exists consists of complexes of sensations, p. 38, while certain classes of properties, Eigenschaften, which act upon our sense organs, he designates, for example, by the letter M, and other classes, which act upon other objects of nature, by the letter N. p. 150, etc. Moreover, Leclerc speaks of nature as the phenomena of the consciousness, Bust's phenomenon, not of a single person, but of mankind. Pages 55 to 56, if we remember that Leclerc published his book in Prague, where Mach was professor of physics, and that Leclerc cites with rapture only Mach's Erhaltung der Arbeit, which appeared in 1872, the question involuntarily arises, ought we not to regard the advocate of fideism and frank idealist Leclerc as the true progenitor of the original philosophy of Mach? As for Supp, who, according to Leclerc, 16, arrived at the same results, he, as we have seen, really claims to defend naive realism, and in his open letter to Professor of Nereus bitterly complains of the established perversion of Supp's theory of knowledge to subjective idealism. The true nature of the crude forgery which the immanentist Supp calls a defense of realism is quite clear from his rejoinder to Wundt, who did not hesitate to class the immanentists with the Fichteans, the subjective idealists. Philosophiestudien, Locke. CIT, pp. 386, 397, 407, Supp retorts to Wundt, in my case the proposition being is consciousness means that consciousness without the external world is inconceivable, that the latter belongs to the former, i.e., the absolute connection, Zusammenhörigkeit, of the one with the other, which I have so often asserted and explained and in which the two constitute the primary whole of being. 17. One must be extremely naive not to discern unadulterated subjective idealism in such realism. Just think, the external world belongs to consciousness and is in absolute connection with it. The poor professor was indeed slandered by the established practice of ranking him with the subjective idealists. Such a philosophy completely coincides with of Nereus' principal coordination. No reservations and protests on the part of Chernov and Valentinov can sunder them. Both philosophies will be consigned together to the Museum of Reactionary Fabrications of German Professordom. As a curiosity once more testifying to Valentinov's lack of judgment, let us note that he calls Supp a solipsist. It goes without saying that Supp vowed and swore that he was not a solipsist, and wrote special articles to this effect, just as vehemently as did Mach, Petzold, and co., yet is highly delighted with Bazarov's article in the Studies. I should like to translate into German Bazarov's dictum that sense perception is the reality existing outside us and forward it to some more or less intelligent immanentist. He would embrace and kiss Bazarov as heartily as the Supps, Leclerc's and Schubert Soderns embraced Mach and Nereus. For Bazarov's dictum is the alpha and omega of the doctrines of the immanentist school. And here, lastly, is Schubert's soldering. The materialism of natural science, the metaphysics of recognizing the objective reality of the external world, is the chief enemy of this philosopher. Grundlegende Erkenntnistheorie, 1884, p. 31 and the whole of Chapter 2, The Metaphysics of Natural Science. Natural science abstracts from all relations of consciousness, p. 52, that is the chief evil, and that is just what constitutes materialism. For the individual cannot escape from sensations and, hence, from a state of consciousness. Pages 33 to 34. Of course, Schubert Soldern admitted in 1896, my standpoint is epistemological solipsism, die Sozialfrage, p. x, but not metaphysical, not practical solipsism. What is given us immediately is sensations, complexes of constantly changing sensations. Aber Transzendenz des Objects und Subjects, p. 73, Schubert Soldern says, Marx took the material process of production as the cause of inner processes and motives, in the same way, and just as falsely, as natural science regards the common, to humanity, external world as the cause of the individual inner worlds. Die Sozialfrage, p. 18, that Marx's historical materialism is connected with natural historical materialism and philosophical materialism in general, it does not even occur to this comrade in arms of Mach to doubt. Many, perhaps the majority, will be of the opinion that from the standpoint of epistemological solipsism no metaphysics is possible, i.e., that metaphysics is always transcendental. Upon more mature reflection I cannot concur with this opinion. Here are my reasons. The immediate foundation of all that is given is the spiritual, solipsist, connection, the central point of which is the individual self, the individual realm of thought, with its body. The rest of the world is inconceivable without this self, just as this self is inconceivable without the rest of the world. With the destruction of the individual self the world is also annihilated, which appears impossible, and with the destruction of the rest of the world, nothing remains for my individual self, for the latter can be separated from the world only logically, but not in time and space. Therefore my individual self must continue to exist after my death also, if the entire world is not to be annihilated with it. Ibid, p. 23, the principal coordination, complexes of sensations and the rest of the machine banalities render faithful service to the proper people. What is the hereafter, das Jenseits, from the solipsist point of view? It is only a possible future experience for me. Ibid, spiritualism would be obliged to prove the existence of the Jenseits. But at any rate the materialism of natural science cannot be brought into the field against spiritualism, for this materialism, as we have seen, is only one aspect of the world process within the all-embracing spiritual connection, equals the principal coordination. p. 24, all this is said in the philosophical introduction to Die Sozialfrage, 1896, wherein Schubert Soldern all the time appears arm in arm with Mach and Avnerius. Only for the handful of Russian machines does Machism serve exclusively for purposes of intellectual prattle. In its native country its role as a flunky to fideism is openly proclaimed. Whither is Empirio-Criticism tending? Let us now cast a glance at the development of Machism after Mach and Avnerius. We have seen that their philosophy is a potpourri of contradictory and disconnected epistemological propositions. We must now examine how and whither, i.e., in what direction, this philosophy is developing, for this will help us to settle certain disputable questions by referring to indisputable historical facts. And indeed, in view of the eclecticism and incoherence of the initial philosophical premises of the trend we are examining, varying interpretations of it and sterile disputes over particulars and trifles are absolutely inevitable. But Empirio-Criticism, like every ideological current, is a living thing, which grows and develops, and the fact that it is growing in one direction or another will help us more than long arguments to settle the basic question as to what the real essence of this philosophy is. We judge a person not by what he says or thinks of himself but by his actions. And we must judge philosophers not by the labels they give themselves: positivism, the philosophy of pure experience; monism or empirio-monism, the philosophy of natural science, etc., but by the manner in which they actually settle fundamental theoretical questions, by their associates, by what they are teaching and by what they have taught their disciples and followers. It is this last question which interests us now. Everything essential was said by Mach and of Nerius more than 20 years ago. It was bound to become clear in the interval how these leaders were understood by those who wanted to understand them, and whom they themselves, at least Mach, who has outlived his colleague, regard as their successors. To be specific, let us take those who themselves claim to be disciples of Mach and of Nerius, or their adherents, and whom Mach himself ranks as such. We shall thus obtain a picture of Empirio-Criticism as a philosophical current, and not as a collection of literary oddities. In Mach's introduction to the Russian translation of the Analysis of Sensations, Hans Cornelius is recommended as a young investigator who is following, if not quite the same, at least very close paths. p. 4. In the text of the Analysis of Sensations, Mach once again mentions with pleasure the works of Cornelius and others, who have disclosed the kernel of Nerius ideas and have developed them further. p. 48. Let us take Cornelius' Introduction to Philosophy, 18, and we find that its author also speaks of his endeavor to follow in the footsteps of Mach and of Nerius. pp. 8, 32. We have before us then a disciple acknowledged by the teacher. This disciple also begins with Sensations Limits, pages 17, 24, categorically declares that he confines himself to experience, p. vi, calls his views consistent or epistemological empiricism, p. 335, emphatically condemns the one-sidedness of idealism and the dogmatism of both the idealists and the materialists, p. 129, vehemently denies the possible misconception, p. 123, that his philosophy implies the recognition of the world as existing in the mind of man, flirts with naive realism no less skillfully than of Nerius, Sup or Bazarov, a visual, as well as every other sense perception, is located where we find it, and only where we find it, that is to say, where the naive mind, untouched by a false philosophy, localizes it, p. 125, and this disciple, acknowledged as such by his teacher, arrives at immortality and God. Materialism, thunders this police sergeant in a professorial chair, I beg your pardon, this disciple of the recent positivists, converts man into an automaton. It need hardly be said that together with the belief in the freedom of our decisions it destroys all considerations of the moral value of our actions and our responsibility for them. Just as little room is left for the idea of the continuation of our life after death. p. 116, the final note of the book is, education, of the youth stultified by this man of science presumably, is necessary not only for action but above all, to inculcate veneration, Ehrfurcht, not for the transitory values of a fortuitous tradition, but for the imperishable values of duty and beauty, for the divine, dem Göttlichen, within us and without. p. 357, compare this with Bogdanov's assertion that there is absolutely no room, Bogdanov's italics, and there cannot be any room for the idea of God, freedom of the will and immortality of the soul in Mach's philosophy in view of his denial of everything in itself. p. 12, while Mach in this same book, p. 293, declares that there is no Machian philosophy, and recommends not only the immanentists, but also Cornelius who had disclosed the kernel of Nerius ideas. Thus, in the first place, Bogdanov absolutely does not know the Machian philosophy as a current which not only nestles under the wing of fideism, but which itself goes to the length of fideism. In the second place, Bogdanov absolutely does not know the history of philosophy, for to associate a denial of the ideas mentioned above with a denial of the thing in itself is to insult the history of philosophy. Will Bogdanov take it into his head to deny that all consistent followers of Hume, by rejecting every kind of thing in itself, do leave room for these ideas? Has Bogdanov never heard of the subjective idealists, who reject every kind of thing in itself and thereby make room for these ideas? There can be no room for these ideas solely in a philosophy that teaches that nothing exists but perceptual being, that the world is matter in motion, that the external world, the physical world familiar to all, is the sole objective reality, i.e., in the philosophy of materialism. And it is for this, precisely for this, that materialism is combated by the immanentists recommended by Mach, by Mach's disciple Cornelius, and by modern professorial philosophy in general. Our Macans began to repudiate Cornelius only after this indecency had been pointed out to them. Such repudiations are not worth much. Friedrich Adler evidently has not been warned, and therefore recommends this Cornelius in a socialist journal. Der Kampf, 1908, 5, p. 235, a work that is easy to read and highly to be commended. Through the medium of Machism, downright philosophical reactionaries and preachers of fideism are palmed off on the workers as teachers. Petzold, without having been warned, detected the falsity in Cornelius, but his method of combating this falsity is a gem. Listen to this: to assert that the world is idea, as is asserted by the idealists, whom we are combating, no joke, has sense only when it implies that it is the idea of the predicator, or, if you like, of all predicators, i.e., that its existence depends exclusively upon the thought of that individual or of those individuals. It exists only inasmuch as he thinks about it, and what he does not think of does not exist. We, on the contrary, make the world dependent not upon the thought of an individual or individuals, or, to put it better and clearer, not upon the act of thinking, or upon any actual thought, but, and exclusively in the logical sense, upon thought in general. The idealist confuses one with the other, and the result is agnostic semi-solipsism, as we observe it in Cornelius. Einführung, 2, 317, Stolypin denied the existence of the cabinets noir. 19. Petzold annihilates the idealists. It is truly astonishing how much this annihilation of idealism resembles a recommendation to the idealists to exercise more skill in concealing their idealism. To say that the world depends upon man's thought is perverted idealism. To say that the world depends upon thought in general is recent positivism, critical realism, in a word, thoroughgoing bourgeois charlatanism. If Cornelius is an agnostic semi-solipsist, Petzold is a solipsist semi-agnostic. You are cracking a flea, gentlemen. Let us proceed. In the second edition of his Erkenntnis und Irrtum, Mach says, a systematic exposition of Mach's views, one to which in all its essentials I can subscribe, is given by Professor Dr. Hans Klein-Peter. Die Erkenntnistheorie der Naturforschung der Gegenwart, 20, Leipzig, 1905. Let us take Hans number 2. This professor is an accredited disseminator of Machism, a pile of articles on Mach's views in philosophical journals, both in German and in English, translations of works recommended by Mach with introductions by Mach, in a word, the right hand of the teacher. Here are his views: all my, outer and inner, experience, all my thoughts and aspirations are given me as a psychical process, as a part of my consciousness. Op. Cit. p. 18, that which we call physical is a construction of psychical elements. p. 144, subjective conviction, not objective certainty, Gewissheit, is the only attainable goal of any science. p. 9, the italics are Klein-Peter's, who adds the following remark: something similar was already said by Kant in the Critique of Practical Reason. The assumption that there are other minds is one which can never be confirmed by experience. p. 42, I do not know whether, in general, there exist other selves outside of myself. p. 43, in section 5, entitled Activity, Spontaneity, in Consciousness, We read that in the case of the animal automaton the succession of ideas is purely mechanical. The same is true of us when we dream. The quality of our consciousness in its normal state essentially differs from this. It possesses a property which these, the automata, entirely lack, and which it would be very difficult, to say the least, to explain mechanically or automatically, the so-called self-activity of the self. Every person can dissever himself from his states of consciousness, he can manipulate them, can make them stand out more clearly or force them into the background, can analyze them, compare various parts, etc. All this is a fact of immediate experience. Our self is therefore essentially different from the sum total of the states of consciousness and cannot be put as an equivalent of it. Sugar consists of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. Were we to attribute a soul to it, then by analogy it would have to possess the faculty of directing the movement of the hydrogen, oxygen and carbon at will. Pages 29 to 30, section 4 of the following chapter is headed, The Act of Cognition, an Act of Will, Willenshandlung. It must be regarded as definitely established that all my psychical experiences are divisible into two large main groups, compulsory acts and deliberate acts. To the former belong all impressions of the external world. p. 47, that it is possible to advance several theories regarding one and the same realm of facts, is as well known to physicists as it is incompatible with the premises of an absolute theory of knowledge. And this fact is also linked with the volitional character of our thought. It also implies that our volition is not bound by external circumstances. p. 50. Now judge how bold Bogdanov was in asserting that in Mach's philosophy there is absolutely no room for free will, when Mach himself recommends such a specimen as Klein Peter. We have already seen that the latter does not attempt to conceal either his own idealism or Mach's. In 1898-99 Klein Peter wrote, Hertz proclaims the same subjectivist view, i.e., as Mach, of the nature of our concepts. If Mach and Hertz, with what justice Klein Peter here implicates the famous physicist we shall soon see, deserve credit from the standpoint of idealism for having emphasized the subjective origin of all our concepts and of the connections between them, and not only of certain individual ones, from the standpoint of empiricism they deserve no less credit for having acknowledged that experience alone, as a court entirely independent of thought, can solve the question of their correctness. Archive for Systematis Philosophiae, B.D. v. 1898-99, pages 169 to 70. In 1900 he wrote that in spite of all the points on which Mach differs from Kant and Berkeley, they at any rate are more akin to him than the metaphysical empiricism prevailing in natural science, i.e., materialism. The professor does not like to call the devil by name, which is indeed the main target of Mach's attacks. Op. Cit. B.D. Vi. p. 87, in 1903 he wrote, The starting point of Berkeley and Mach is irrefutable. Mach completed what Kant began. Kant Studien, B.D. 8, 1903, pages 314, 274. In the preface to the Russian edition of the Analysis of Sensations Mach also mentions Tzian, who is following, if not the same, at least very close paths. We take Professor Theodor Tzian's book The Psychophysiological Theory of Knowledge, Psychophysiology or Kenntnistheorie, Jena, 1898, and find that the author refers to Mach, of Nereus, Sup, and so forth in the very introduction. Here therefore we again have a case of a disciple acknowledged by the teacher. Tzian's recent theory is that only the mob is capable of believing that real objects evoke our sensations, p. 3, and that, over the portals of the theory of knowledge there can be no other inscription than the words of Berkeley, the external objects subsist not by themselves, but exist in our minds. p. 5, what is given us is sensations and ideas. Both are embraced by the word psychical. Non-psychical is a word devoid of meaning. p. 100, the laws of nature are relations not of material bodies but of reduced sensations. p. 104, This new concept, reduced sensations, contains everything that is original in Zian's Berkeleyanism. Petzold repudiated Zian as an idealist as far back as 1904 in the second volume of his Introduction. Pages 298 to 301. By 1906 he had already included Cornelius, Klein-Peter, Zian and Verworn, Das Weltproblem, p. 137, footnote, in the list of idealists or psychomanists. In the case of all these worthy professors, you see, there is a misconception in their interpretations of the views of Mach and of Nereus. Ibid, poor Mach and of Nereus. Not only were they slandered by their enemies for idealism and even, as Bogdanov expresses it, solipsism, but their very friends, disciples and followers, expert professors, also understood their teachers pervertedly, in an idealist sense. If Empirio-Criticism is developing into idealism, that by no means demonstrates the radical falsity of its muddled Berkeleyan basic premises. God forbid. It is only a slight misconception, in the Nozdrov Petzold, 21, sense of the term. The funniest thing of all perhaps is that Petzold himself, the guardian of purity and innocence, fiercely supplemented Mach and of Nereus with his logical a priori and, secondly, coupled them with Wilhelm Sump, the vehicle of fideism. Had Petzold been acquainted with Mach's English adherents he would have had very considerably to extend the list of Machans who had lapsed, because of a misconception, into idealism. We have already referred to Karl Pearson, whom Mach praised, as an unadulterated idealist. Here are the opinions of two other slanderers who say the same thing of Pearson. Professor Pearson is merely echoing a doctrine first given clear utterance by the truly great Berkeley. Howard V. Knox, Mind, Volume 6, 1897, p. 205. There can be no doubt that Mr. Pearson is an idealist in the strictest sense of the word. Georges Rodier, Revue Philosophique, 1888, 2, Volume 26, p. 200. The English idealist, William Clifford, whom Mach regards as coming very close to his philosophy, Analysis of Sensations, p. 8, must be considered a teacher rather than a disciple of Mach, for Clifford's philosophical works appeared in the 70s. Here the misconception is due to Mach himself, who in 1901 failed to notice the idealism in Clifford's doctrine that the world is mind stuff, a social object, a highly organized experience, and so forth. 22. For a characterization of the charlatanism of the German Machans, it is sufficient to note that Klein-Peter in 1905 elevated this idealist to the rank of founder of the epistemology of modern science. On page 284 of the Analysis of Sensations, Mach mentions the kindred, to Buddhism and Machism, American philosopher, Paul Carus. Carus, who calls himself an admirer and personal friend of Mach, edits in Chicago The Monist, a journal devoted to philosophy, and The Open Court, a journal devoted to the propagation of religion. Science is divine revelation, say the editors of this popular little journal, and they express the opinion that science can bring about a reform of the Church that will retain all that is true and good in religion. Mach is a regular contributor to The Monist and publishes in it individual chapters from his latest works. Carus corrects Mach ever so little a la Kant, and declares that Mach is an idealist or, as we would say, a subjectivist. There are, no doubt, differences between Mach's views and mine, although I at once recognized in him a kindred spirit. 23. Our monism, says Carus, is not materialistic, not spiritualistic, not agnostic, it merely means consistency. It takes experience as its basis and employs as method the systematic forms of the relations of experience, evidently a plagiarism from Bogdanov's Empirio-monism. Carus' motto is, not agnosticism, but positive science, not mysticism, but clear thinking, not supernaturalism, not materialism, but a monistic view of the world, not a dogma, but religion, not greed, but faith. And in conformity with this motto Carus preaches a new theology, a scientific theology, or theonomy, which denies the literalness of the Bible but insists that all truth is divine and God reveals himself in science as he does in history. 24. It should be remarked that Klein-Peter, in his book on the theory of knowledge of modern science already referred to, recommends Charis, together with Ostwald, of Nereus and the Eminentists. Pages 151-52. When Haeckel issued his theses for a monistic alliance, Charis vigorously opposed him on the ground that, first, Haeckel vainly attempts to refute a priorism, which is quite in keeping with scientific philosophy; second, that Haeckel's doctrine of determinism excludes the possibility of free will; third, that Haeckel is mistaken in emphasizing the one-sided view of the naturalist against the traditional conservatism of the churches. Thus he appears as an enemy to the existing churches instead of rejoicing at their higher development into a new and truer interpretation of their dogmas. Ibid, Volume 16, 1906, p. 122. Charis himself admits that I appear reactionary to many freethinkers who blame me for not joining their chorus in denouncing all religion as superstition. p. 355. It is quite evident that we have here a leader of a gang of American literary fakers who are engaged in doping the people with religious opium. Mach and Klein-Peter joined this gang evidently as the result of a slight misconception. A. Bogdanov's Empirio-Monism. Bogdanov writes of himself, I personally know so far of only one Empirio-Monist in literature, a certain A. Bogdanov. But I know him very well and can answer for it that his views fully accord with the sacramental formula of the primacy of nature over mind. To wit, he regards all that exists as a continuous chain of development, the lower links of which are lost in the chaos of elements, while the higher links, known to us, represent the experience of men. Bogdanov's italics, psychical and, still higher, physical experience. This experience, and the knowledge resulting therefrom, correspond to what is usually called mind. Empirio-Monism, Book 3, p. 12. The sacramental formula here ridiculed by Bogdanov is the well-known proposition of Engels, whom Bogdanov, however, diplomatically avoids mentioning. We do not differ from Engels, oh, no. But let us examine more carefully Bogdanov's own summary of his famous Empirio-Monism and substitution. The physical world is called the experience of men, and it is declared that physical experience is higher in the chain of development than psychical. But this is utter nonsense. And it is precisely the kind of nonsense that is characteristic of all idealist philosophies. It is simply farcical for Bogdanov to class this system as materialism. With me, too, he says, nature is primary and mind secondary. If Engels' definition is to be thus construed, then Hegel is also a materialist, for with him, too, psychical experience, under the title of the absolute idea, comes first, then follow, higher up, the physical world, nature, and, lastly, human knowledge, which through nature apprehends the absolute idea. Not a single idealist will deny the primacy of nature taken in this sense, for it is not a genuine primacy, since in fact nature is not taken as the immediately given, as the starting point of epistemology. Nature is in fact reached as the result of a long process through abstraction of the psychical. It is immaterial what these abstractions are called, whether absolute idea, universal self, world will, and so on and so forth. These terms distinguish the different varieties of idealism, and such varieties exist in countless numbers. The essence of idealism is that the psychical is taken as the starting point, from it external nature is deduced, and only then is the ordinary human consciousness deduced from nature. Hence, this primary psychical always turns out to be a lifeless abstraction concealing a diluted theology. For instance, everybody knows what a human idea is, but an idea independent of man and prior to man, an idea in the abstract, an absolute idea, is a theological invention of the idealist Hegel. Everybody knows what human sensation is, but sensation independent of man, sensation prior to man, is nonsense, a lifeless abstraction, an idealist artifice. And it is precisely to such an idealistic artifice that Bogdanov resorts when he erects the following ladder. 1. The chaos of elements. We know that no other human concept lies back of the term element save sensation. 2. The psychical experience of men. 3. The physical experience of men. 4. The knowledge emerging therefrom. There are no sensations, human, without man. Hence, the first rung of this ladder is a lifeless idealist abstraction. As a matter of fact, what we have here is not the usual and familiar human sensations, but fictitious sensations, nobody's sensations, sensations in general, divine sensations, just as the ordinary human idea became divine with Hegel when it was divorced from man and man's brain. So away with the first rung. Away also with the second rung, for the psychical before the physical, and Bogdanov places the second rung before the third, is something unknown to man or science. The physical realm existed before the psychical could have appeared, for the latter is the highest product of the highest forms of organic matter. Bogdanov's second rung is also a lifeless abstraction, it is thought without brain, human reason divorced from man. Only when we throw out the first two rungs, and only then, can we obtain a picture of the world that truly corresponds to science and materialism. To wit, 1. The physical world exists independently of the mind of man and existed long prior to man, prior to any human experience. 2. The psychical, the mind, etc., is the highest product of matter, i.e., the physical, it is a function of that particularly complex fragment of matter called the human brain. The realm of substitution, writes Bogdanov, coincides with the realm of physical phenomena. For the psychical phenomena we need substitute nothing, because they are immediate complexes. p. 39, and this precisely is idealism, for the psychical, i.e., consciousness, idea, sensation, etc., is taken as the immediate and the physical is deduced from it, substituted for it. The world is the non-ego created by the ego, said Fichte. The world is absolute idea, said Hegel. The world is will, said Schopenhauer. The world is conception and idea, says the immanentist Rieck. Being is consciousness, says the immanentist Supp. The physical is a substitution for the psychical, says Bogdanov. One must be blind not to perceive the identical idealist essence under these various verbal cloaks. Let us ask ourselves the following question, writes Bogdanov in Book the First of Empirio-Monism, pages 128–29, what is a living being, for instance, man? And he answers, man is primarily a definite complex of immediate experiences. Mark, primarily. Then, in the further development of experience, man becomes both for himself and for others a physical body amidst other physical bodies. Why, this is a sheer complex of absurdities, fit only for deducing the immortality of the soul, or the idea of God, and so forth. Man is primarily a complex of immediate experiences and in the course of further development becomes a physical body. That means that there are immediate experiences without a physical body, prior to a physical body. What a pity that this magnificent philosophy has not yet found acceptance in our theological seminaries. There its merits would have been fully appreciated. We have admitted that physical nature itself is a product, Bogdanov's italics, of complexes of an immediate character, to which psychical coordinations also belong, that it is the reflection of such complexes in others, analogous to them, but of the most complex type, in the socially organized experience of living beings. p. 146, a philosophy which teaches that physical nature itself is a product, is a philosophy of the priests pure and simple. And its character is in no wise altered by the fact that personally Bogdanov emphatically repudiates all religion. Dühring was also an atheist, he even proposed to prohibit religion in his socialitarian order. Nevertheless, Engels was absolutely right in pointing out that Dühring's system could not make ends meet without religion. 25. The same is true of Bogdanov, with the essential difference that the quoted passage is not a chance inconsistency but the very essence of his empirio-monism and of all his substitution. If nature is a product, it is obvious that it can be a product only of something that is greater, richer, broader, mightier than nature, of something that exists, for in order to produce nature, it must exist independently of nature. That means that something exists outside nature, something which moreover produces nature. In plain language this is called God. The idealist philosophers have always sought to change this latter name, to make it more abstract, more vague and at the same time, for the sake of plausibility, to bring it nearer to the psychical, as an immediate complex, as the immediately given which requires no proof. Absolute idea, universal spirit, world will, general substitution of the psychical for the physical, are different formulations of one and the same idea. Every man knows, and science investigates, idea, mind, will, the psychical, as a function of the normally operating human brain. To divorce this function from substance organized in a definite way, to convert this function into a universal, general abstraction, to substitute this abstraction for the whole of physical nature, this is the raving of philosophical idealism and a mockery of science. Materialism says that the socially organized experience of living beings is a product of physical nature, a result of a long development of the latter, a development from a state of physical nature when no society, organization, experience, or living beings existed or could have existed. Idealism says that physical nature is a product of this experience of living beings, and in saying this, idealism is equating, if not subordinating, nature to God. For God is undoubtedly a product of the socially organized experience of living beings. No matter from what angle you look at it, Bogdanov's philosophy contains nothing but a reactionary muddle. Bogdanov thinks that to speak of the social organization of experience is cognitive socialism. BK 3, p. 34, this is insane twaddle. If socialism is thus regarded, the Jesuits are ardent adherents of cognitive socialism, for the basis of their epistemology is divinity as socially organized experience. And there can be no doubt that Catholicism is a socially organized experience, only, it reflects not objective truth, which Bogdanov denies, but which science reflects, but the exploitation of the ignorance of the masses by definite social classes. But why speak of the Jesuits? We find Bogdanov's cognitive socialism in its entirety among the eminentists, so beloved of Mach. Lechler regards nature as the consciousness of mankind, Der Realismus, p. 55, and not of the individual. The bourgeois philosophers will serve you up any amount of such Fittian cognitive socialism. Supp also emphasizes das Generis, das Gattungsmassige des Bewusstseins, Virtuelle Schrift für Wissenschaftliche Philosophie, BD 17, pages 379–80, i.e., the generic factor of consciousness. To think that philosophical idealism vanishes when the consciousness of mankind is substituted for the consciousness of the individual, or the socially organized experience for the experience of one person, is like thinking that capitalism vanishes when one capitalist is replaced by a joint stock company. Our Russian Makins, Yushkevich, and Valentinov, echo the materialist Rakhmetov in asserting that Bogdanov is an idealist, at the same time foully abusing Rakhmetov himself. But they could not stop to think where this idealism came from. They make out that Bogdanov is an individual and chance phenomenon, an isolated case. This is not true. Bogdanov personally may think that he has invented an original system, but one has only to compare him with the aforementioned disciples of Mach to realize the falsity of such an opinion. The difference between Bogdanov and Cornelius is far less than the difference between Cornelius and Karras. The difference between Bogdanov and Karras is less, as far as their philosophical systems are concerned, of course, and not the deliberateness of their reactionary implications, than the difference between Karras and Zion, and so on. Bogdanov is only one of the manifestations of that socially organized experience which testifies to the growth of Machism into idealism. Bogdanov, we are here, of course, speaking exclusively of Bogdanov as a philosopher, could not have come into God's world had the doctrines of his teacher Mach contained no elements of Berkeleyanism. And I cannot imagine a more terrible vengeance on Bogdanov than to have his Empirio-Monism translated, say, into German and presented for review to Lechler and Schubert Sottern, Cornelius, and Klein Peter, Karras and Pillin, the French collaborator and disciple of Renouvier. The compliments that would be paid by these outright comrades in arms and, at times, direct followers of Mach to the substitution would be much more eloquent than their arguments. However, it would scarcely be correct to regard Bogdanov's philosophy as a finished and static system. In the 9 years from 1899 to 1908, Bogdanov has gone through 4 stages in his philosophical peregrinations. At the beginning he was a natural historical materialist, i.e., semi-consciously and instinctively faithful to the spirit of science. His fundamental elements of the historical outlook on nature bears obvious traces of that stage. The second stage was the energetics of Ostwald, which was so fashionable in the latter 90s, a muddled agnosticism which at times stumbled into idealism. From Ostwald, the title page of Ostwald's lectures on natural philosophy bears the inscription, dedicated to E. Mach. Bogdanov went over to Mach, that is, he borrowed the fundamental premises of a subjective idealism that is as inconsistent and muddled as Mach's entire philosophy. The fourth stage is an attempt to eliminate some of the contradictions of Machism, and to create a semblance of objective idealism. The theory of general substitution shows that Bogdanov has described a curve of almost 180 degrees from his starting position. Is this stage of Bogdanov's philosophy more remote or less remote from dialectical materialism than the previous stages? If Bogdanov remains in one place, then he is, of course, more remote. If he keeps moving along the same curve in which he has been moving for the last 9 years, he is less remote. He now has only one serious step to make in order to return once more to materialism, namely, universally to discard his whole universal substitution. For this universal substitution gathers into one Chinese pigtail all the transgressions of half-hearted idealism and all the weaknesses of consistent subjective idealism, just as, see Licet Parva Companere Magnus. If it is permissible to compare the great with the small, Hegel's absolute idea gathered together all the contradictions of Kantian idealism and all the weaknesses of Fittinism. Feuerbach had to make only one serious step in order to return to materialism, namely, universally to discard, absolutely to eliminate, the absolute idea, that Hegelian substitution of the psychical for physical nature. Feuerbach cut off the Chinese pigtail of philosophical idealism, in other words, he took nature as the basis without any substitution whatever. We must wait and see whether the Chinese pigtail of Machian idealism will go on growing for much longer. The theory of symbols, or hieroglyphs, and the criticism of Helmholtz as a supplement to what has been said above of the idealists as the comrades in arms and successors of Empirio-Criticism, it will be appropriate to dwell on the character of the Machian criticism of certain philosophical propositions touched upon in our literature. For instance, our Machian would-be Marxists fastened with glee on Plekhanov's hieroglyphs, that is, on the theory that man's sensations and ideas are not copies of real things and processes of nature, not their images, but conventional signs, symbols, hieroglyphs, and so on. 26. Bazarov ridicules this hieroglyphic materialism, and, it should be stated, he would be right in doing so if he rejected hieroglyphic materialism in favor of non-hieroglyphic materialism. But Bazarov here again resorts to a sleight of hand and palms off his renunciation of materialism as a criticism of hieroglyphism. Engels speaks neither of symbols nor of hieroglyphs, but of copies, photographs, images, mirror reflections of things. Instead of pointing out the erroneousness of Plekhanov's deviation from Engels' formulation of materialism, Bazarov uses Plekhanov's error in order to conceal Engels' truth from the reader. To make clear both Plekhanov's error and Bazarov's confusion, we shall refer to an important advocate of the theory of symbols, calling a symbol a hieroglyph changes nothing, Helmholtz, and shall see how he was criticized by the materialists and by the idealists in conjunction with the Mechans. Helmholtz, a scientist of the first magnitude, was as inconsistent in philosophy as are the great majority of scientists. He tended towards Kantianism, but in his epistemology he did not adhere even to these views consistently. Here, for instance, are some passages on the subject of the correspondence of ideas and objects from his Handbook of Physiological Optics, 27. I have designated sensations as merely symbols for the relations of the external world, and I have denied that they have any similarity or equivalence to what they represent. French translation, p. 579, German original, p. 442, this is agnosticism, but on the same page further on we read, our concepts and ideas are effects wrought on our nervous system and our consciousness by the objects that are perceived and apprehended. This is materialism. But Helmholtz is not clear as to the relation between absolute and relative truth, as is evident from his subsequent remarks. For instances, a little further on he says, I therefore think that there can be no possible meaning in speaking of the truth of our ideas save as a practical truth. Our ideas of things cannot be anything but symbols, naturally given signs for things, which we learn to use in order to regulate our movements and actions. When we have learned to read these symbols rightly, we are in a position with their aid to direct our actions so as to achieve the desired result. This is not correct. Helmholtz here lapses into subjectivism, into a denial of objective reality and objective truth. And he arrives at a flagrant untruth when he concludes the paragraph with the words, an idea and the object it represents obviously belong to two entirely different worlds. Only the Kantians thus divorce idea from reality, consciousness from nature. However, a little further on we read, as to the properties of the objects of the external world, a little reflection will show that all the properties we may attribute to them merely signify the effects wrought by them either on our senses or on other natural objects. French ed. p. 581, German original, p. 445, I translate from the French. Here again Helmholtz reverts to the materialist position. Helmholtz was an inconsistent Kantian, now recognizing a priori laws of thought, now tending towards the transcendental reality of time and space, i.e., to a materialist conception of them, now deriving human sensations from external objects, which act upon our sense organs, and now declaring sensations to be only symbols, i.e., certain arbitrary signs divorced from the entirely different world of the things signified. Cf. Victor Hayfelder, Über den Begriff der Erfahrung bei Helmholtz, Helmholtz's Conception of Experience, Berlin, 1897. This is how Helmholtz expressed his views in a speech delivered in 1878 on Facts and Perception, a noteworthy pronouncement from the realistic camp. As Leckler characterized this speech, our sensations are indeed effects wrought by external causes in our organs, and the manner in which such effects manifest themselves, of course, depends very essentially on the nature of the apparatus on which these effects are wrought. Inasmuch as the quality of our sensation informs us of the properties of the external action by which this sensation is produced, the latter can be regarded as its sign, Zeichen, but not as its image. For a certain resemblance to the object imaged is demanded of an image. But a sign need not resemble that of which it is a sign. Vort Regent Redden, Lectures and Speeches, 1884, BD. 2, p. 226. If sensations are not images of things, but only signs or symbols which do not resemble them, then Helmholtz's initial materialist premise is undermined, the existence of external objects becomes subject to doubt, for signs or symbols may quite possibly indicate imaginary objects, and everybody is familiar with instances of such signs or symbols. Helmholtz, following Kant, attempts to draw something like an absolute boundary between the phenomenon and the thing in itself. Helmholtz harbors an insuperable prejudice against straightforward, clear, and open materialism. But a little further on he says, I do not see how one could refute a system even of the most extreme subjective idealism that chose to regard life as a dream. One might declare it to be highly improbable and unsatisfactory. I myself would in this case subscribe to the severest expressions of dissent, yet it could be constructed consistently. The realistic hypothesis, on the contrary, trusts the evidence, usage, of ordinary self-observation, according to which the changes of perception that follow a certain action have no psychical connection with the preceding impulse of volition. This hypothesis regards everything that seems to be substantiated by our everyday perception, viz., the material world outside of us, as existing independently of our ideas. Undoubtedly, the realistic hypothesis is the simplest we can construct. It has been tested and verified in an extremely broad field of application. It is sharply defined in its several parts and, therefore, it is in the highest degree useful and fruitful as a basis of action. Pages 242-43. Helmholtz's agnosticism also resembles shamefaced materialism, with certain Kantian twists, in distinction to Huxley's Berkeleyan twists. Albrecht Rau, a follower of Feuerbach, therefore vigorously criticizes Helmholtz's theory of symbols as an inconsistent deviation from realism. Helmholtz's basic view, says Rau, is a realistic hypothesis, according to which we apprehend the objective properties of things with the help of our senses. 28. The theory of symbols cannot be reconciled with such a view, which, as we have seen, is wholly materialist, for it implies a certain distrust of perception, a distrust of the evidence of our sense organs. It is beyond doubt that an image cannot wholly resemble the model, but an image is one thing, a symbol, a conventional sign, another. The image inevitably and of necessity implies the objective reality of that which it images. Conventional sign, symbol, hieroglyph are concepts which introduce an entirely unnecessary element of agnosticism. Albrecht Rau, therefore, is perfectly right in saying that Helmholtz's theory of symbols pays tribute to Kantianism. Rau says, had Helmholtz remained true to his realistic conception, had he consistently adhered to the basic principle that the properties of bodies express the relations of bodies to each other and also to us, he obviously would have had no need of the whole theory of symbols. He could then have said, briefly and clearly, the sensations which are produced in us by things are reflections of the nature of those things. Ibid. p. 320, that is the way a materialist criticizes Helmholtz. He rejects Helmholtz's hieroglyphic or symbolic materialism or semi-materialism in favor of Feuerbach's consistent materialism. The idealist Lechler, a representative of the immanentist school, so dear to Mach's heart and mind, also accuses Helmholtz of inconsistency, of wavering between materialism and spiritualism. Der Realismus, p. 154. But for Lechler the theory of symbols is not insufficiently materialistic but too materialistic. Lechler says, Helmholtz thinks that the perceptions of our consciousness offer sufficient support for the cognition of sequence in time as well as of the identity or non-identity of transcendental causes. This in Helmholtz's opinion is sufficient for the assumption and cognition of law in the realm of the transcendental, i.e., in the realm of the objectively real. p. 33, and Lechler thunders against this dogmatic prejudice of Helmholtz's. Berkeley's God as the hypothetical cause of the conformity to natural law of the ideas in our mind is at least just as capable of satisfying our need of causality as a world of external objects. p. 31, a consistent application of the theory of symbols can achieve nothing without the generous admixture of vulgar realism, i.e., materialism. p. 35. This is how a critical idealist criticized Helmholtz for his materialism in 1879. 20 years later, in his article The Fundamental Views of Ernst Mach and Heinrich Hertz on Physics, 29, Klein Peter, the disciple of Mach so highly praised by his teacher, refuted in the following way the antiquated Helmholtz with the aid of Mach's recent philosophy. Let us for the moment leave aside Hertz, who, in fact, was as inconsistent as Helmholtz, and examine Klein-Peter's comparison of Mach and Helmholtz. Having quoted a number of passages from the works of both writers, and having particularly stressed Mach's well-known statements to the effect that bodies are mental symbols for complexes of sensations and so on, Klein-Peter says, if we follow Helmholtz's line of thought, we shall encounter the following fundamental premises. 1. There exist objects of the external world. 2. A change in these objects is inconceivable without the action of some cause, which is thought of as real. 3. Cause, according to the original meaning of the word, is the unchangeable residue or being behind the changing phenomena, namely, substance and the law of its action, force. The quotation is taken by Klein-Peter from Helmholtz. 4. It is possible to deduce all phenomena from their causes in a logically strict and uniquely determined manner. 5. The achievement of this end is equivalent to the possession of objective truth, the acquisition, Erlangung, of which is thus regarded as conceivable. p. 163, rendered indignant by these premises, by their contradictoriness and their creation of insoluble problems, Klein-Peter remarks that Helmholtz does not hold strictly to these views and sometimes employs turns of speech which are somewhat suggestive of Mach's purely logical understanding of such words as matter, force, causality, etc. It is not difficult to find the source of our dissatisfaction with Helmholtz, if we recall Mach's fine, clear words. The false understanding of the words mass, force, etc., is the basic weakness of Helmholtz's whole argument. These are only concepts, products of our imagination and not realities existing outside of thought. We are not even in a position to know such things. From the observation of our senses we are in general unable, owing to their imperfection, to make even a single uniquely determined conclusion. We can never assert, for instance, that upon reading a certain scale, Durchschnittliche Skala, we shall obtain a definite figure. There are always, within certain limits, an infinite number of possible figures all equally compatible with the facts of the observation. And to have knowledge of something real lying outside us, that is for us impossible. Let us assume, however, that it were possible, and that we did get to know reality. In that case we would have no right to apply the laws of logic to it, for they are our laws, applicable only to our conceptions, to our mental products. Klein-Peter's italics. Between facts there is no logical connection, but only a simple succession. Apodictic assertions are here unthinkable. It is therefore incorrect to say that one fact is the cause of another and, consequently, the whole deduction built up by Helmholtz on this conception falls to the ground. Finally, the attainment of objective truth, i.e., truth existing independently of any subject, is impossible, not only because of the nature of our senses, but also because as men, as mentioned, we can in general have no notion of what exists quite independently of us. p. 164, as the reader sees, our disciple of Mach, repeating the favorite phrases of his teacher and of Bogdanov, who does not own himself a Machin, rejects Helmholtz's whole philosophy, rejects it from the idealist's standpoint. The theory of symbols is not even especially singled out by the idealist, who regards it as an unimportant and perhaps accidental deviation from materialism. And Helmholtz is chosen by Klein-Peter as a representative of the traditional views in physics, view shared to this day by the majority of physicists. p. 160. The result we have arrived at is that Plekhanov was guilty of an obvious mistake in his exposition of materialism, but that Bazarov completely muddled the matter, mixed up materialism with idealism and advanced in opposition to the theory of symbols, or hieroglyphic materialism, the idealist nonsense that sense perception is the reality existing outside us. From the Kantian Helmholtz, just as from Kant himself, the materialists went to the left, the Machins to the right. Two kinds of criticism of Dühring. Let us note another characteristic feature in the Machin's incredible perversion of materialism. Valentinov endeavors to beat the Marxists by comparing them to Bushna, who supposedly has much in common with Plekhanov, although Engels sharply dissociated himself from Bushna. Bogdanov, approaching the same question from another angle, defends, as it were, the materialism of the natural scientists, which, he says, is usually spoken of with a certain contempt. Empirio-monism, B.K. 3, p. X. Both Valentinov and Bogdanov are wretchedly muddled on this question. Marx and Engels always spoke contemptuously of bad socialists, but from this it follows that they demanded the teaching of correct socialism, scientific socialism, and not a flight from socialism to bourgeois views. Marx and Engels always condemned bad, and, particularly, anti-dialectical, materialism, but they condemned it from the standpoint of a higher, more advanced dialectical materialism, and not from the standpoint of humanism or Berkeleianism. Marx, Engels and Dietzgen would discuss the bad materialists, reason with them and seek to correct their errors. But they would not even discuss the Humenes and Berkeleians, Mach and Avnerius, confining themselves to a single still more contemptuous remark about their trend as a whole. Therefore, the endless faces and grimaces made by Armachans over Holbach and Co., Bushna and Co., etc., are absolutely nothing but an attempt to throw dust in the eyes of the public, a cover for the departure of Marxism as a whole from the very foundations of materialism in general, and a fear to take up a straightforward and clear position with regard to Engels. And it would be hard to express oneself more clearly on the French materialism of the 18th century and on Bushna, Vogt, and Muscat, than Engels does at the end of Chapter 2 of his Ludwig Feuerbach. It is impossible not to understand Engels, unless one deliberately wishes to distort him. Marx and I are materialists, says Engels in this chapter, explaining what fundamentally distinguishes all schools of materialism from the whole camp of the idealists, from all the Kantians and Humenes in general. And Engels reproaches Feuerbach for a certain pusillanimity, a certain frivolity of thought, as expressed in his rejection at times of materialism in general because of the mistakes of one or another school of materialists. Feuerbach should not have confounded the doctrines of these hedge preachers, Bushna and Co., with materialism in general. 30, says Engels. p. 21. Only minds that are spoilt by reading and credulously accepting the doctrines of the German reactionary professors could have misunderstood the nature of such reproaches leveled by Engels at Feuerbach. Engels says very clearly that Bushna and company by no means overcame the limitations of their teachers, i.e., the materialists of the 18th century, that they had not made a single step forward. And it is for this, and this alone, that Engels took Bushna and company to task, not for their materialism, as the ignoramuses think, but because they did not advance materialism, because it was quite outside their scope to develop the theory of materialism any further. It was for this alone that Engels took Bushna and company to task, and thereupon point by point Engels enumerates three fundamental limitations, beschränkt that, of the French materialists of the 18th century, from which Marx and Engels had emancipated themselves, but from which Bushna and company were unable to emancipate themselves. The first limitation was that the views of the old materialists were mechanical, in the sense that they believed in the exclusive application of the standards of mechanics to processes of a chemical and organic nature. p. 19. We shall see in the next chapter that failure to understand these words of Engels caused certain people to succumb to idealism through the new physics. Engels does not reject mechanical materialism for the faults attributed to it by physicists of the recent idealist, alias Mucken, trend. The second limitation was the metaphysical character of the views of the old materialists, meaning the anti-dialectical character of their philosophy. This limitation is fully shared with Bushna and company by Armachans, who, as we have seen, entirely failed to understand Engels' application of dialectics to epistemology, for example, absolute and relative truth. The third limitation was the preservation of idealism up above, in the realm of the social sciences, a non-understanding of historical materialism. Having enumerated these three limitations and explained them with exhaustive clarity, pages 19 to 21, Engels then and there adds that they, Büchner and co., did not emerge from these limits, über diese Schranken. Exclusively for these three things and exclusively within these limits, does Engels refute both the materialism of the 18th century and the doctrines of Büchner and co. On all other, more elementary, questions of materialism, questions distorted by the Machins, there is and can be no difference between Marx and Engels on the one hand and all these old materialists on the other. It was only the Russian Machins who brought confusion into this perfectly clear question, since for their West European teachers and co-thinkers the radical difference between the line of Mach and his friends and the line of the materialists generally is perfectly obvious. Our Machins found it necessary to confuse the issue in order to represent their break with Marxism and their desertion to the camp of bourgeois philosophy as minor corrections of Marxism. Take Dühring. It is hard to imagine anything more contemptuous than the opinion of him expressed by Engels. But at the same time that Dühring was criticized by Engels, just see how he was criticized by Lechler, who praises Mach's revolutionizing philosophy. Lechler regards Dühring as the extreme left of materialism, which without any evasion declares sensation, as well as every activity of consciousness and intelligence in general, to be the secretion, function, supreme flower, aggregate effect, etc., of the animal organism. Der Realismus, 1879, pages 23 to 24, is it for this that Engels criticized Dühring? No. In this he was in full agreement with Dühring, as he was with every other materialist. He criticized Dühring from the diametrically opposite standpoint, namely, for the inconsistency of his materialism, for his idealist fancies, which left a loophole for fideism. Nature itself works both within ideating beings and from without, in order to create the required knowledge of the course of things by systematically producing coherent views. Lechler quotes these words of Dühring's and savagely attacks the materialism of such a point of view, the crude metaphysics of this materialism, the self-deception, etc., etc. Pages 160 and 161 to 1963, is it for this that Engels criticized Dühring? No. He ridiculed all florid language, but as regards the cognition of objective law in nature, reflected by the consciousness, Engels was fully in agreement with Dühring, as he was with every other materialist. Thought is a form of reality higher than the rest. A fundamental premise is the independence and distinction of the materially real world from the groups of manifestations of the consciousness. Lechler quotes these words of Dühring's together with a number of Dühring's attacks on Kant, etc., and for this accuses Dühring of metaphysics, pages 218 to 22, of subscribing to a metaphysical dogma, etc. Is it for this that Engels criticized Dühring? No. That the world exists independently of the mind and that every deviation from this truth on the part of the Kantians, Humines, Berkeleians, and so forth, is false. On this point Engels was fully in agreement with Dühring, as he was with every other materialist. Had Engels seen from what angle Lechler, in the spirit of Mach, criticized Dühring, he would have called both these philosophical reactionaries names 100 times more contemptuous than those he called Dühring. To Lechler, Dühring was the incarnation of pernicious realism and materialism, cf. Also Betrage zu einer monistischen Erkenntnistheorie, 1882, p. 45. In 1878, W. Sup, teacher and comrade in arms of Mach, accused Dühring of visionary realism, Traumrealismus, 31, in revenge for the epithet visionary idealism which Dühring had hurled against all idealists. For Engels, on the contrary, Dühring was not a sufficiently steadfast, clear and consistent materialist. Marx and Engels, as well as J. Dietzken, entered the philosophical arena at a time when materialism reigned among the advanced intellectuals in general, and in working-class circles in particular. It is therefore quite natural that they should have devoted their attention not to a repetition of old ideas but to a serious theoretical development of materialism, its application to history, In other words, to the completion of the edifice of materialist philosophy up to its summit. It is quite natural that in the sphere of epistemology they confine themselves to correcting Feuerbach's errors, to ridiculing the banalities of the materialist Dühring, to criticizing the errors of Büchner, C.J. Dietzgen, to emphasizing what these most widely known and popular writers among the workers particularly lacked, namely, dialectics. Marx, Engels and J. Dietzgen did not worry about the elementary truths of materialism, which had been cried by the hucksters in dozens of books, but devoted all their attention to ensuring that these elementary truths should not be vulgarized, should not be oversimplified, should not lead to stagnation of thought, materialism below, idealism above, to forgetfulness of the valuable fruit of the idealist systems, Hegelian dialectics, that pearl which those farmyard cocks, the Büchners, the Dührings and company, as well as Lechler, Mach, Avnerius and so forth, could not pick out from the dung heap of absolute idealism. If one envisages at all concretely the historical conditions in which the philosophical works of Engels and J. Dietzgen were written, it will be perfectly clear why they were more concerned to dissociate themselves from the vulgarization of the elementary truths of materialism than to defend the truths themselves. Marx and Engels were similarly more concerned to dissociate themselves from the vulgarization of the fundamental demands of political democracy than to defend these demands. Only disciples of the philosophical reactionaries could have failed to notice this circumstance, and could have presented the case to their readers in such a way as to make it appear that Marx and Engels did not know what being a materialist means. How could J. Dietzgen have found favor with the reactionary philosophers? The previously cited example of Helfand already contains the answer to this question, and we shall not examine the innumerable instances in which J. Dietzgen receives Helfand-like treatment at the hands of Armikins. It is more expedient to quote a number of passages from J. Dietzgen himself in order to bring out his weak points. Thought is a function of the brain, says Dietzgen. Das Wesen der menschlichen Kopfarbeit, 1903, p. 52. There is a Russian translation, thought is a product of the brain. My desk, as the content of my thought, is identical with that thought, does not differ from it. But my desk outside of my head is a separate object quite distinct from it. p. 53. These perfectly clear materialistic propositions are, however, supplemented by Dietzgen thus: nevertheless, the non-sensible idea is also sensible, material, i.e., real. The mind differs no more from the table, light, or sound than these things differ from each other. p. 54. This is obviously false. That both thought and matter are real, i.e., exist, is true. But to say that thought is materialist to make a false step, a step towards confusing materialism and idealism. As a matter of fact, this is only an inexact expression of Dietzgen's, who elsewhere correctly says, mind and matter at least have this in common, that they exist. p. 80. Dietzgen says, thinking is a work of the body. In order to think I require a substance that can be thought of. This substance is provided in the phenomena of nature and life. Matter is the boundary of the mind, beyond which the latter cannot pass. Mind is a product of matter, but matter is more than a product of mind. p. 64. The Mikins refrained from analyzing materialist arguments of the materialist Dietzgen such as these. They prefer to fasten on passages where he is inexact and muddled. For example, he says that scientists can be idealists only outside their field. p. 108. Whether this is so, and why it is so, on this the Mikins are silent. But a page or so earlier Dietzgen recognizes the positive side of modern idealism, p. 106, and the inadequacy of the materialist principle, which should rejoice the Mikins. The incorrectly expressed thought of Dietzgen's consists in the fact that the difference between matter and mind is also relative and not excessive. p. 107. This is true, but what follows from this is not that materialism as such is inadequate, but that metaphysical, antidialectical materialism is inadequate. Simple, Scientific truth is not based on a person. It has its foundation outside, i.e., of the person, in its material. It is objective truth. We call ourselves materialists. Philosophical materialists are distinguished by the fact that they put the corporeal world at the beginning, at the head, and put the idea, or spirit, as the sequel, whereas their opponents, after the manner of religion, derive things from the word. The material world from the idea. Kleiner Philosophieschriften, 1903, pages 59, 62. The Muckins avoid this recognition of objective truth and repetition of Engels' definition of materialism. But Dietzgen goes on to say, we would be equally right in calling ourselves idealists, for our system is based on the total result of philosophy, on the scientific investigation of the idea, on a clear insight into the nature of mind. p. 63. It is not difficult to seize upon this obviously incorrect phrase in order to deny materialism. Actually, Dietzgen's formulation is more inexact than his basic thought, which amounts to this, that the old materialism was unable to investigate ideas scientifically, with the aid of historical materialism. Here are Dietzgen's ideas on the old materialism. Like our understanding of political economy, our materialism is a scientific, historical conquest. Just as definitely as we distinguish ourselves from the socialists of the past, so we distinguish ourselves from the old materialists. With the latter we have only this in common, that we acknowledge matter to be the premise, or prime base of the idea. p. 140. This word only is significant. It contains the whole epistemological foundation of materialism, as distinguished from agnosticism, machism, idealism. But Dietzgen's attention is here concentrated on dissociating himself from vulgar materialism. But then follows a little further on a passage that is quite incorrect. The concept matter must be broadened. It embraces all the phenomena of reality, as well as our faculty of knowing or explaining. p. 141. This is a muddle which can only lead to confusing materialism and idealism under the guise of broadening the former. To seize upon this broadening would be to forget the basis of Dietzgen's philosophy, the recognition of matter as the primary, the boundary of the mind. But, as a matter of fact, a few lines further down Dietzgen corrects himself, the whole governs the part, matter the mind. In this sense we may love and honor the material world as the first cause, as the creator of heaven and earth. p. 142. That the conception of matter must also include thoughts, as Dietzgen repeats in the Excursions, op. cit. p. 214, is a muddle, for if such an inclusion is made, the epistemological contrast between mind and matter, idealism and materialism, a contrast upon which Dietzgen himself insists, loses all meaning. That this contrast must not be made excessive, exaggerated, metaphysical, is beyond dispute, and it is to the great credit of the dialectical materialist Dietzgen that he emphasized this. The limits of the absolute necessity and absolute truth of this relative contrast are precisely those limits which define the trend of epistemological investigations. To operate beyond these limits with a distinction between matter and mind, physical and mental, as though they were absolute opposites, would be a great mistake. Dietzgen, unlike Engels, expresses his thoughts in a vague, unclear, mushy way. But apart from his defects of exposition and his individual mistakes, he not unsuccessfully champions the materialist theory of knowledge, pages 222 and 271, Dialectical Materialism, p. 224. He says, the materialist theory of knowledge then amounts to the recognition that the human organ of perception radiates no metaphysical light, but is a piece of nature which reflects other pieces of nature. Pages 222 to 23. Our perceptive faculty is not a supernatural source of truth, but a mirror-like instrument, which reflects the things of the world, or nature. p. 243. Our profound Muckins avoid an analysis of each individual proposition of Dietzgen's materialist theory of knowledge, but seize upon his deviations from that theory, upon his vagueness and confusion. J. Dietzgen could find favor with the reactionary philosophers only because he occasionally gets muddled. And, it goes without saying, where there is a muddle there you will find Machins. Marx wrote to Q. Gelman on December 5, 1868, a fairly long time ago. He, Dietzgen, sent me a fragment of a manuscript on the faculty of thought which, in spite of a certain confusion and of too frequent repetition, contains much that is excellent and, as the independent product of a working man, admirable. Russian translation, p. 53. 32. Mr. Valentinov quotes this opinion, but it never dawned on him to ask what Marx regarded as Dietzgen's confusion, whether it was that which brings Dietzgen close to Mach, or that which distinguishes Dietzgen from Mach. Mr. Valentinov does not ask this question because he read both Dietzgen and Marx's letters after the manner of Gogol's Petrushka. Yet it is not difficult to find the answer to this question. Marx frequently called his world outlook dialectical materialism, and Engels anti-Dühring, the whole of which Marx read through in manuscript, expounds precisely this world outlook. Hence, it should have been clear even to the Valentinovs that Dietzgen's confusion could lie only in his deviation from a consistent application of dialectics, from consistent materialism, in particular from anti-Dühring. Does it now dawn upon Mr. Valentinov and his brethren that what Marx could call Dietzgen's confusion is only what brings Dietzgen close to Mach, who went from Kant not towards materialism, but towards Berkeley and Hume? Or was it that the materialist Marx called Dietzgen's materialist theory of knowledge confused, yet approved his deviations from materialism, that is, approved what differs from anti-Dühring, which was written with his, Marx's, participation? Whom are they trying to fool, our Machins, who desire to be regarded as Marxists and at the same time inform the world that their Mach approved of Dietzgen? Have our heroes failed to guess that Mach could approve in Dietzgen only that which Marx called confusion? But taken as a whole, J. Dietzgen does not deserve so severe a censure. He is 9/10 a materialist and never made any claims either to originality or to possessing a special philosophy distinct from materialism. He spoke of Marx frequently, and invariably as the head of the trend, Kleiner Philosophieschriften, p. 4. An opinion uttered in 1873, on page 95 to 1876, he emphasizes that Marx and Engels possessed the necessary philosophical training. On page 181 to 1886, he speaks of Marx and Engels as the acknowledged founders of the trend. Dietzgen was a Marxist, and Eugene Dietzgen, and, alas, Comrade P. Dog are rendering him left-handed service by their invention of naturmonismus, Dietzgenism, etc. Dietzgenism as distinct from dialectical materialism is confusion, a step towards reactionary philosophy, an attempt to create a trend not from what is great in Joseph Dietzgen, and in that worker-philosopher, who discovered dialectical materialism in his own way, there is much that is great, but from his weak points. I shall confine myself to two examples in order to illustrate how Comrade P. Dog and Eugene Dietzgen are sliding into reactionary philosophy. In the second edition of the Exquisite, 33, p. 273, Dog writes, even bourgeois criticism points out the connection between Dietzgen's philosophy and Empirio-Criticism and also the immanentist school, and, further on, especially Leckler, a quotation from a bourgeois criticism. That P. Dog values and esteems J. Dietzgen cannot be doubted. But it also cannot be doubted that he is defaming him by citing without protest the opinion of a bourgeois scribbler who classes the sworn enemy of fideism and of the professors, the graduated flunkies of the bourgeoisie, with the outspoken preacher of fideism and avowed reactionary, Leckler. It is possible that Dog repeated another's opinion of the immanentists and of Leckler without himself being familiar with the writings of these reactionaries. But let this serve him as a warning. The road away from Marx to the peculiarities of Dietzgen, to Mach, to the immanentists, is a road leading into a morass. To class him not only with Leckler but even with Mach is to lay stress on Dietzgen the muddlehead as distinct from Dietzgen the materialist. I shall defend Dietzgen against Dog. I assert that Dietzgen did not deserve the shame of being classed with Leckler. And I can cite a witness, a most authoritative one on such a question, one who is as much a reactionary, as much a fideist and immanentist philosopher as Leckler himself, namely, Schubert Soldering. In 1896 he wrote, "The Social Democrats willingly lean for support on Hegel with more or less, usually less, justification, but they materialize the Hegelian philosophy, cf. J. Dietzgen." With Dietzgen, the absolute becomes the universal, and this becomes the thing in itself, the absolute subject, whose appearances are its predicates. That he, Dietzgen, is thus converting a pure abstraction into the basis of the concrete process, he does not, of course, realize any more than Hegel himself did. He frequently chaotically lumps together Hegel, Darwin, Haeckel, and natural scientific materialism. Die Sozialfrage, p. 33. Schubert Soldern is a keener judge of philosophical shades than Mach, who praises everybody indiscriminately, including the Kantian Jerusalem. Eugene Dietzgen was so simple-minded as to complain to the German public that in Russia the narrow materialists had insulted Joseph Dietzgen, and he translated Plekhanov's and Dogg's articles on Joseph Dietzgen into German. See Joseph Dietzgen, Erkenntnis und Wahrheit, Knowledge and Truth, Stuttgart, 1908, Appendix. The poor naturalist's complaints rebounded on his own head. Franz Mehring, who may be regarded as knowing something of philosophy and Marxism, wrote in his review that Plekhanov was essentially right as against Dogg, Die Neue Zeit, 1908, number 38, 19. Juni, Feuilleton, p. 432. That J. Dietzgen got into difficulties when he deviated from Marx and Engels, p. 431, is for Mehring beyond question. Eugene Dietzgen replied to Mehring in a long, sniveling note, in which he went so far as to say that J. Dietzgen might be of service in reconciling the Roaring Brothers, the Orthodox and the Revisionists. Die Neue Zeit, 1908, number 44, 31. Julie, p. 652, another warning, Comrade Dogg, the road away from Marx to Dietzgenism and Machism is a road into the morass, not for individuals, not for Tom, Dick, and Harry, but for the trend. And do not complain, Messrs. Muckins, that I quote the authorities. Your objections to the authorities are but a screen for the fact that for the socialist authorities, Marx, Engels, Lafargue, Mehring, Kautsky, you are substituting bourgeois authorities, Mach, Petzold, Ovnarius and the eminentists. You would do better not to raise the question of authorities and authoritarianism. Notes: 1. V. Empirio-Criticism, a monarchist and extreme reactionary. Founder of the Union of the Russian People, the Black Hundreds. 2. A. Rau, Ludwig Feuerbach's Philosophie, die Naturforschung die Philosophiskritik der Gegenwart, Ludwig Feuerbach's Philosophy, Natural Science and a Modern Philosophical Critique, Leipzig, 1882, pages 87 to 89. 3. This refers to the opportunist trend that developed within the German Social Democratic Party in the second half of the 70s of the 19th century. Its chief ideologists were Karl Hochberg, Edward Bernstein, and Karl August Schramm, who were influenced by Dührerism. Bernstein and Louis Virich, along with Johann Most and others, actively helped to spread the eclectic views of Eugene Dühring among the German Social Democrats. Hochberg, who, as Marx expressed it, had bought his way into the party by his money, demanded that socialism should be made a movement of humanity in general based on the sense of justice of both the oppressed and the representatives of the upper classes. Et. 4. P. Lafargue, Le Materialisme de Marx et l'Idéalisme de Kant, Marx's Materialism and Kant's Idealism, Le Socialiste, 25th of February, 1900. 5. Mess. Volume 2, p. 376. Ed. 6. Lenin is referring to Engels' work Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, 1888, and the special introduction to the English edition of 1892 of his Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, see Ch4, Volume 2, pages 370-71, 99-102. Ed. 7, see Ch4, Volume 2, p. 378. Ed. 8, Bibliothèque Ducangers International de Philosophie, Volume 4, H. Delacroix, David Hume et la philosophie critique, David Hume and Critical Philosophy. Among the followers of Hume the author includes Avenarius and the eminentists in Germany, see Renouvier and his school, the Neo-Criticists, in France. 9. C. F. Engels' special introduction to the English edition of 1892 of his Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Ch4, Volume 2, p. 99, ed. 10. Virtuersschrift für wissenschaftliche Philosophie, 1894, 18. Jarg, Heft I, p. 29. 11. Dr. R. von Schubert-Soldern, Über Transzendenz des Objekts und Subjekts, On the Transcendence of the Object and Subject, 1882, p. 37 and 5. Cf. Also his Grundlagen Erkenntnis Theory, Principles of a Theory of Knowledge, 1884, p. 3. 12. Virtuersschrift für wissenschaftliche Philosophie, 17. Jarg, 1893, p. 384. 13. Dr. R. von Schubert-Soldern, Das menschliche Glück und die Sozialfrage, Human Happiness and the Social Question, 1896, pp. 5, 6. 14. Zerrift für eminente Philosophie, B.D. I. Berlin, 1896, pages 6, 9. 15. Realists in Modern Philosophy, certain representatives of the immanentist school who have emerged from Kantianism, the school of Avenarius, and many other kindred movements, find that there are absolutely no grounds for rejecting the basis of naive realism. Studies, p. 26, 16, Betrachtung zu einer monistischen Erkenntnistheorie, Essays in a Monistic Theory of Knowledge, Breslau, 1882, p. 10. 17. W. Sup, Die eminente Philosophie und Wilhelm Wundt, The Immanent Philosophy and Wilhelm Wundt, Zerrift für eminente Philosophie, Band 2, p. 195. 18. H. Cornelius, Einleitung in die Philosophie, Introduction to Philosophy, German ed., 1903, ed. 19, p. A. Stolypin, Prime Minister under the Tsar from 1906 to 1911. Ed. 20. The Theory of Knowledge of Modern Natural Science. 21. Nozdrov, a character in N. V. Gogol's novel Dead Souls, a landlord, swindler and troublemaker. Gogol called him a historical personage, since wherever he appeared histories and prose developed. Ed. 22. W. K. Clifford, Lectures and Essays, 3rd ed., London, 1901, Volume 2, pages 55, 65, 69. On this point I agree entirely with Berkeley and not with Mr. Spencer, p. 58. The object, then, is a set of changes in my consciousness, and not anything out of it. p. 52. 23. The Monist, Volume 16, 1906, July, B. Karras, Professor Max Philosophy, pages 320, 345, 333. The article is a reply to an article by Kleinpeter which appeared in the same journal. 24. Ibid, Volume 13, p. 24 et seq., Theology as a Science, an article by Karras. 25. C. F. Engels, Anti-Dühring, Well-Read Books, 2017, pages 374-79. 26. In Geneva in 1892 appeared the first Russian edition of Engels' work Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, translated by G. V. Plekhanov and with a foreword and notes by him. Commenting on Engels' formulation of the fundamental question of philosophy and characterization of agnosticism, Plekhanov gave a critical exposition of the theory of knowledge of a number of trends of idealist philosophy, Hume, Kant, the neo-Kantians, etc., and counterposed to them the materialist theory of knowledge. In doing so he committed an error by saying, "Our sensations are in their way hieroglyphs which inform us of what is taking place in reality. The hieroglyphs do not resemble the events convoyed by them. But they can with complete fidelity convey both the events themselves, and, what is the main thing, the relations existing between them." G. V. Plekhanov, Selected Philosophical Works, Volume 1, Moscow, p. 536, in 1905, in the notes to the second edition of Engels' work, Plekhanov admitted, "I also failed to express myself quite exactly." Ibid, p. 545, Plekhanov's error, although appearing to be a question of terminology, was a concession to agnosticism and bore witness to his insufficiently profound understanding of the dialectics of the process of cognition. Ed. 27, H. Helmholtz, Handbuch der Physiologie Synoptik. Ed. 28, A. Rau, Empfinden und Denken, Sensation and Thought, Gießen, 1896, p. 304. 29, Archive for Philosophie, Philosophical Archives, B.D. v. 1899, pages 163–64. 30, C. Mesue, Volume 2, p. 375. 31, W. Sup, Erkenntnistheoretische Logik, Epistemological Logic, Bonn, 1878, p. 56. 32, K. Marx, Letters to Q. Gelman, English ed., 1934, p. 80. Ed. 33, P. Dog wrote an afterword entitled Joseph Dietzgen and His Critic, G. Plekhanov, to the second Russian edition of Joseph Dietzgen's Exquisite der Philosophie. Ed. 5. The